Hello there, and welcome to Planet in Question, where curiosity finds its calm and science takes the scenic route towards sleep. Tonight, we're not rushing through facts or theories, we're slowing them down, letting them breathe so we can listen to the quiet questions that linger beneath the surface of history. Questions that don't demand an answer, but invite imagination instead. Wherever you are right now, take a small moment to notice it. Maybe it's late at night and the room around you is dim, the air soft, the sounds few. Maybe you're travelling, watching lights drift by through a window. Or maybe this plays quietly in the background while you unwind after a long day. However you've arrived here, you and I are about to drift together, not through cities or stars, but through time itself, all the way back to when the world was still deciding what life could be. It was more than 500 million years ago. The Earth was familiar in shape, but alien in spirit. No trees, no flowers, no birds in the sky, or footsteps on the land. The continents were bare, scoured by wind and tide. The real story was underwater, in the dim light of shallow seas that shimmered with strange colours, turquoise and grey-green, rich with minerals and oxygen newly awakened in the water. For billions of years before this, life had been quiet, microscopic, simple. Single-celled organisms drifting like dust motes in sunlight, multiplying, dividing, and surviving without much variation. The pace of existence was glacial. Change came slowly, almost imperceptibly. And then, suddenly, something extraordinary happened. In the fossil record, it appears like a door opening all at once. A burst of new forms, new shapes, new ways of being. Animals with eyes, creatures with skeletons and teeth and legs. Organisms that hunted, crawled, burrowed and built. It was the first time the planet became truly alive, in the way we recognize life now, complex, mobile, aware. This event has a name, the Cambrian Explosion. A phrase that feels almost too dramatic for something that unfolded over millions of years. But in the scale of Earth's 4.5 billion year story, it really was an explosion. A sudden bloom of complexity, after an eternity of stillness. Scientists have spent generations trying to explain how this happened. The conventional story is one of thresholds. Oxygen levels rising, genetic innovations accumulating, ecosystems interacting in new ways. Small causes cascading into vast consequences. And it's a good story, beautiful, elegant, supported by layers of rock and fossil evidence. But even within that understanding, there's a lingering strangeness. The Cambrian explosion doesn't quite fit the rhythm of evolution as we know it. It feels orchestrated, as though something tipped the balance, or perhaps whispered to life, now. That's the question we'll explore tonight, not with certainty or with alarm, but with wonder. What if the Cambrian explosion wasn't entirely natural? What if the sudden flourishing of life wasn't just a coincidence of chemistry and climate, but something more deliberate? Maybe not a divine miracle or a sci-fi intervention, but a moment of intention woven into the fabric of Earth itself. When we look back on those ancient seas, it's easy to forget how much mystery remains. The fossils we've found, tiny impressions in shale and limestone, are only fragments, brief snapshots of a world that once teemed with motion. Trilobites scuttled across the seafloor, their eyes complex and crystalline. Worms tunneled through sediment, sculpting the first true ecosystems. Predators like Anomalocaris drifted through the water, vast and graceful, their bodies gleaming with armor-like plates. These creatures seem complete, purposeful, as if they arrived already designed. In earlier layers of rock we find almost nothing like them, just microbial mats and the faintest traces of soft-bodied life. The jump feels too large, too sudden, like flipping the page of a book and finding an entirely new language written there. Some scientists suggest the answer lies in genes specifically, in a set of genetic instructions known as the Hox genes. These are like the blueprints for building bodies, determining where limbs, eyes, and organs should grow. During the Cambrian period, it's believed that these genes diversified, unlocking endless possibilities for form and structure. Yet that raises another question. Why then? Why, after billions of years of near silence, did life suddenly discover how to build itself in so many new ways? It's almost as though evolution itself received an update. A new set of instructions, or perhaps a signal saying it was time to advance. And that idea, however speculative, holds a certain poetry, because in a way the Cambrian explosion isn't just a story about biology, it's about awakening. It's the moment Earth began to imagine what it could become. Imagine standing, if you could, in those waters 540 million years ago. The sea would be shallow and warm, tinted with minerals. Strange plants, really more like algae, would sway beneath you, catching the faint light from a sun filtered through haze. The ground underfoot would be soft and uneven, alive with creatures leaving tiny trails as they moved. There would be no sound as we know it, only the slow rhythm of currents and the occasional flicker of motion in the murky blue. Every few moments, something new would drift into view, something no eye had ever seen before. And maybe, if you let your imagination drift far enough, you might feel it, that quiet sense of transition, as though the planet itself were stirring after a long sleep. Evolution doesn't plan, it doesn't dream. But the Cambrian explosion feels like the closest thing nature has ever done to dreaming aloud. Still, it's fair to wonder, could something or someone have helped it along? Not in the way of myths or movies, but in a deeper sense. Could the universe itself be alive enough to guide its own unfolding? Maybe the explosion wasn't a violation of natural law, but the fulfillment of it. Perhaps the laws of chemistry and energy, given enough time, were destined to reach this crescendo, as inevitable as a wave reaching the shore. But what if that inevitability was not random? What if it was designed into the equation from the beginning? To think this way doesn't mean rejecting science. It means widening the frame, allowing for the possibility that nature is more intricate than we imagine. That perhaps intelligence, whatever its form, has always been part of the story, not something that appeared late in evolution, but something embedded in the very process itself. After all, intelligence didn't come from outside the universe. It arose within it, which means that even in those early oceans, something like mind might already have been present, waiting to surface. The Cambrian explosion is not just an event in prehistory, it's a mirror. When we look into it, we see both the mystery of our origins and the limits of our understanding. Maybe it was purely natural, the perfect storm of conditions, or maybe nature itself is the mystery and unfolding consciousness that learns through creation. Either way, what happened in those ancient seas shaped everything that came after. Every animal, every plant, every thought we have now traces back to that moment when the world decided to become complex. So tonight, let's drift into that deep past, not as scientists trying to prove or disprove, but as quiet travelers looking for perspective. Let's imagine what it felt like when life first woke up and looked back at the world around it, when the Earth for the first time began to notice itself. Because whether by chance or by choice, the Cambrian explosion was the beginning of everything that knows it exists, including us. Now, if you're comfortable, take one last slow breath. The journey from here will be gentle. We'll step into those primeval waters together, exploring what might have stirred them, and what it means to call something natural at all. Because sometimes, even the most ordinary words like evolution, or creation, or life can hold deeper meanings when spoken softly enough. Tonight, we'll listen for those meanings. We'll drift into the deep blue of prehistory and see if, perhaps, the Cambrian explosion was less an accident of nature and more a quiet conversation between the universe and itself. 1. Before the bloom, before the Cambrian world burst into life, there was an age of stillness, an era so long and so quiet that by comparison, all of human history feels like a single breath. To step into that time in your imagination, you have to let go of everything that feels familiar about life. There were no forests or fields, no insects, no birdsong. The continents were barren and raw, their surfaces scoured by wind and rain. The skies were thick and often tinted orange with dust and volcanic gases. The land was a lonely place, waiting. The real story, the only story, was written beneath the water. If you were to drift through one of those oceans more than 550 million years ago, you would find a world tinted green and gold, illuminated by a sun that filtered through layers of microorganisms floating near the surface. The water would be warmer than most of our seas today, dense with minerals and faintly glowing from the chemical reactions happening in its depths. It would feel alive, but only just. The creatures here were not yet animals as we understand them. They were simpler, slippery colonies of single-celled life that gathered into mats across the seabed or floated freely in currents, absorbing sunlight and nutrients in their endless, slow dance of survival. For billions of years, this was Earth's rhythm. patient, microscopic, and nearly invisible. Life's earliest architects were bacteria and algae, creatures so small they could pass through the eye of a needle by the thousands. They covered rocks in thin, living films, releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, in amounts too small to matter at first, but growing, year by year, into something world-changing. These invisible workers were the planet's first gardeners, though they would never know it. They built the conditions for everything that would come after oxygen for breath, minerals for bones, and chemical balance for evolution's great experiments. The seas of that ancient world were not empty exactly, but they were simple. Picture layers of time stacked in still water, a film of microbes near the surface, another a few feet below, then another, each layer feeding the next. The bottom was dark, silent, covered with fine silt and the remains of organisms that had lived and died without leaving fossils behind. There were no predators yet, no nervous system, no sound of movement except the slow pulse of currents against the seafloor. Occasionally, something extraordinary would happen. A small leap, a new form. A cell would learn to swallow another cell and keep it alive inside. A colony of bacteria might begin to move as one, responding to light or food. These were the quiet inventions that paved the way for everything else. Each advance was microscopic, but each one rewrote what life could mean. Evolution didn't hurry, it waited, adjusting, refining, storing potential the way a seed stores an entire forest within its shell. Imagine floating there, weightless in the dim light, watching these first multicellular beings take shape. They were soft-bodied, fragile, and strange beyond description, more like living blankets than animals. Some spread across the seafloor like lace, filtering nutrients from the water. Others rose upward in slow spirals, reaching for sunlight. They had no eyes, no mouths, no bones. They were the quiet geometry of beginnings, each pattern a test of what might one day work better. Scientists call these early forms the Ediacaran organisms, and they lived in the twilight before the Cambrian dawn. Their fossils appear like ghostly impressions in ancient rock, delicate fronds, ovals and discs pressed into sandstone. Some look like leaves, others like jellyfish or ferns, though they were none of these. Their shapes hint at experiments in form and function, the first drafts of what would later become more complex designs. But the Ediacaran world was slow. Its creatures drifted through eons with little change, almost as if evolution were asleep. Then something began to stir. The chemistry of the oceans shifted. Oxygen levels rose higher than they had ever been. Nutrients poured into the water from volcanic eruptions and eroding rocks. Temperatures stabilized after long cycles of glaciation. The conditions became perfect, as though the planet itself were exhaling after a long, patient breath. Some invisible threshold was crossed, and when it was, life responded in kind. From a distance, it might have looked sudden, but if you could stretch those millions of years into a visible film, you'd see a slow unfurling, a gathering energy that built towards something new. Patterns began to repeat, refine and multiply. Organisms started forming shells, spines and exoskeletons. Eyes began to appear, capable of perceiving light and movement. Muscles formed, enabling motion that was not just drifting but purposeful. For the first time, creatures could chase, hide, and choose. Yet before that awakening, there was still the calm on earth that felt almost meditative in its simplicity. Sometimes I like to think of those ages as the planet's long preparation, a kind of dreaming. Life existed, yes, but not yet with urgency. It was learning itself, quietly exploring the rules that would one day define its endless creativity. There is something deeply peaceful in that image. The oceans not yet filled with noise or struggle, only the soft exchange of chemistry and light. When we look at those early layers of rock, we're not just seeing stone, we're seeing pages from the Earth's first memory. Embedded in those minerals are chemical whispers of what the world once felt like. We can measure the oxygen levels, trace the carbon isotopes, and even infer the temperature of those ancient seas. But the atmosphere of that time, the feeling of it, can only be imagined. I picture it as heavy and strange, with a faint shimmer on the horizon where the first living mats reached upward, turning sunlight into breath. There would have been no blue sky as we know it, no green vegetation to colour the land, only vast plains of stone, dust and water under a dim sun, and somewhere within that, the first sparks of awareness taking hold. What fascinates many scientists and dreamers alike is how balanced that long prelude seems. The world was not barren, it was preparing. Every chemical cycle, every eruption, every glacial melt played a part in building the stage for the Cambrian. If you were to compress Earth's history into a single year, this quiet prelude would occupy almost 11 months, with the explosion of complex life happening only in the final few days. For nearly the entire year, the planet existed in slow motion, forming mountains, sculpting oceans, and letting simple life refine itself. It's humbling to think that most of Earth's history happened before anything even had a face. And yet, that silence is where everything began. Without those billions of years of microbial patience, there could have been no sudden flourishing later on. It's a reminder that transformation rarely happens all at once. Beneath every leap forward lies an eternity of preparation, a foundation so vast and so hidden that we almost never see it. Maybe the Cambrian explosion wasn't as abrupt as it seems from our perspective. Maybe it was the inevitable blossoming of seeds planted long before, nurtured in darkness until the time was right. Still, there's a mystery there. Why then? Why did the Earth, after so long a slumber, suddenly open its eyes? Some say it was just chemistry, oxygen reaching a tipping point, minerals combining in new ways. Others wonder if it was something more subtle, a shift in the planet's energy, a moment when conditions aligned so perfectly that life couldn't help but innovate. There's even a quiet line of thought that suggests intelligence itself might have had a hand, not necessarily alien, but intrinsic to the universe. That perhaps evolution is guided not only by random chance, but by a kind of hidden logic that pushes complexity forward when the moment calls for it. If that were true, then even the stillness before the Cambrian would not have been empty. It would have been a waiting silence, rich with intention, a pause before the first great song of life. So, as we begin this journey through the ancient seas, remember the quiet that came before, the calm waters, the drifting forms, the endless patience of a planet learning how to live. Because before every explosion of life, there is always a breath, a gathering stillness, a moment where everything seems asleep, but is, in truth, preparing to awaken. In that stillness, the blueprint of all future worlds was already written. The trilobites, the ammonites, the forests, the mammals, even us all waiting, unformed, inside that calm. And when the time came, when the conditions aligned and the long breath was released, the world bloomed. But before the bloom, there was the quiet sea, the patient planet, and the gentle hum of life just beginning to dream of what it could become. 2. The moment everything changed. If you could pause the long, slow clock of Earth and watch it tick through eons, there would be a moment, faint at first, when something in the rhythm of life began to quicken. The seas that had once been still and simple began to shimmer with movement, as if the water itself were remembering how to stir. Shapes that had slumbered in simplicity began to stretch and twist, building muscles, eyes, shells, and nerves. In the blink of a geological eye, the oceans transformed from soft microbial gardens into vast theatres of motion and purpose. That was the Cambrian explosion, the instant in Earth's grand story, when everything changed. The term explosion sounds violent, but this was not a single event or cataclysm. It was more like a sunrise after a billion-year night. For ages, life had crept along in near silence, tiny forms floating through shallow seas. And then, as if awakened by some unseen cue, it began to create in abundance hundreds of new body plans, new ways of sensing, moving, and living. It was not one creature that changed, but all of them, together. The world became suddenly experimental, overflowing with possibility. If you could drift through those Cambrian waters, you might not even recognize them as part of the same planet. The seafloor teemed with life burrows, trails, feeding marks, all signs of activity. In every direction, something moved. Some creatures glided, others crawled, others darted forward in sharp bursts of motion. Light filtered down from above, scattering across suspended minerals and plankton, revealing flashes of colour from shells and scales. Predators lurked in the dimness, their new eyes catching the faint shimmer of prey. This was the first time on Earth that seeing became survival. Before this era, most organisms had no need for vision. Light was only a signal of warmth, not of threat or opportunity. But now, with movement came risk, and with risk came perception. The trilobite, perhaps the most famous of the Cambrian animals, had compound eyes made of crystal-like lenses, capable of detecting motion with astonishing precision. To be seen was to be vulnerable, to see was to have power, and with that power, evolution began its first arms race. It's difficult to imagine the pace of innovation that followed. In only a few tens of millions of years, nearly every major body plan we know today emerged. Worms developed muscles for burrowing. Early arthropods formed exoskeletons and jointed limbs. Sponges, once motionless, diversified into new shapes. Even the ancestors of vertebrates, the line that would one day lead to fish, reptiles, mammals, and humans, appeared for the first time, delicate and translucent, with faint backbones running through their soft bodies. The foundations of the modern biosphere were written then, all at once, like a sudden burst of creativity in the planet's long composition. If we were to watch this moment unfold, it might not look like chaos, but choreography. Each new adaptation led to another. Shells gave rise to predators with crushing jaws, which in turn inspired faster swimmers and better armor. Vision prompted camouflage. Burrowing prompted hard ground and new habitats. Life was no longer drifting, it was interacting, competing, cooperating, evolving in visible dialogue. The ocean floor became a web of relationships. Every creature, part of a conversation that had just begun. Scientists often try to pinpoint why this sudden complexity arose. Some suggest that oxygen levels in the ocean reached a critical threshold, fueling metabolism for larger and more active creatures. Others point to the evolution of predation, which forced defensive adaptations and accelerated change. Another factor may have been the breakup of ancient continents, creating shallow seas rich in nutrients and niches. Each of these ideas explains a part of the story, but not the whole. Because the truth is, even with all our knowledge, the Cambrian explosion still feels like a mystery that defies easy logic. Perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. It wasn't just an environmental shift, it was a change in the very behavior of life itself. For billions of years, evolution had been slow and patient, content with simplicity. Then, in a moment that could almost be described as impatient, it leapt forward. Something in the pattern of existence seemed to wake up, as if the rules themselves had bent toward complexity. If the Precambrian world was Earth's dreaming, then the Cambrian explosion was the first moment it opened its eyes. In the fossils left behind, we see traces of this awakening: perfectly preserved shells, segmented limbs, delicate gills. In some places, entire communities are frozen in stone, caught mid-movement by sudden mudslides or oxygen-poor waters. The Burgess Shale in Canada is one such window into that ancient time. Its black rocks are like pages from a lost book, each containing a story of something new that once swam, crawled, or glided through the Cambrian seas. Creatures like Opabinia, with 5 eyes and a long trunk-like appendage, or Hallucigenia, with its spines and legs arranged in surreal symmetry. They look almost like dreams given form half familiar, half alien, as though life were still experimenting with the vocabulary of shape. When you gaze at these fossils, it's easy to feel that something deliberate was unfolding. Not deliberate in a conscious sense, perhaps, but in a way that suggests direction, a natural compulsion toward complexity, as if life itself desired to explore every possible path. You can see it in the way forms branch, in the way symmetry emerges and repeats. There's artistry in evolution, a pattern that feels both random and guided, chaotic and precise. Some thinkers, even within science, have wondered whether evolution contains a kind of memory, a tendency to self-organize, to move from simplicity to complexity as though following an internal logic. The Cambrian explosion would be the moment that logic reached a threshold, when feedback loops between life and environment suddenly cascaded into something irreversible. Once life learned to build itself in new ways, it could never go back. And yet, there's another layer to this mystery. For all its apparent suddenness, the Cambrian explosion required the groundwork of everything that came before. The genetic machinery, the chemical cycles, the stability of the atmosphere all had to be in place. It's almost as if the world had been quietly preparing for this event, refining every detail before allowing the curtain to rise. When conditions finally aligned, evolution didn't hesitate. It bloomed. Imagine standing on the edge of one of those primeval shores, the water lapping against bare rock. You look down into the shallows, and instead of stillness, you see movement, tiny shadows gliding across the sand. trails where something small has crawled. Above, the sunlight ripples across the surface, illuminating forms that never existed before. It would be overwhelming, like watching colour appear in a world that had been grayscale for eons. The ocean itself would seem alive, not as a backdrop but as a participant, carrying these new forms into being. If we think of Earth as a living system, then the Cambrian explosion was a heartbeat, a surge of vitality that changed everything that followed. In a sense, it was the planet's first act of self-expression. Each new organism was not just adapting to its surroundings, it was also shaping them, altering the chemistry of the oceans, building reefs, cycling nutrients, creating the foundations for future worlds. The biosphere became a feedback network, alive in every direction. There's a quiet beauty in that thought. Evolution, often described as random and blind, also contains moments of elegance so precise they seem almost intentional. The timing of the Cambrian explosion, its balance of chaos and order, feels less like an accident and more like a moment the universe had been waiting for. When we look back now, from the comfort of our modern world, it's tempting to think of this time as distant, irrelevant, a long-lost prelude. But every heartbeat in your chest, every blink of your eye, every movement of your hands is an echo of what began there. The capacity to sense, to move, to think, to dream, all of it traces back to that moment when the world decided to become alive in motion. Maybe that's why the Cambrian explosion still feels almost sacred. It was the first time Earth became aware enough to notice itself, through the eyes of creatures that could see, through the instincts of those that could feel hunger, curiosity, fear. The sea was no longer just water and chemistry, it was experience. And so the stillness of the Precambrian was replaced by music. The soft clatter of shells, the stirring of limbs, the pulse of life testing its boundaries. From that moment onward, evolution would never again be silent. It would be a story of movement, of trial and change, of endless experimentation in the art of survival. Something profound shifted in those waters, something that still moves within us now. The Earth did not just create life, life began creating itself. And in that first surge of creativity, whether guided by chance, chemistry, or something far older and wiser, the universe looked at its reflection and, for the first time, saw it move. 3. The puzzle of time. The Cambrian explosion is often described as a miracle written in stone, but when you look closely at those ancient layers, the story becomes more complicated. Time, after all, is not as steady as it seems. To us, 1,000,000 years feels infinite, unimaginable. But to the Earth, 1,000,000 years is an eye blink, a single turn in a slow dance that has lasted 4.5 billion. The puzzle of the Cambrian is that it straddles these two scales, fast enough to seem miraculous, slow enough to be invisible, while it happened. The more we try to measure it, the more it slips between the fingers of our understanding. Imagine time not as a line but as an ocean, tides of pressure and temperature, of chemistry and light, flowing across the planet. In the deep, before the Cambrian, those tides moved lazily. Evolution was a slow current, shaping life almost imperceptibly. Then, suddenly, the water began to churn. New forms appeared, not one by one but in waves, as though something had disturbed the stillness. It's as if the clock of the Earth, which had been ticking quietly for billions of years, was suddenly wound tighter. The result was a burst of change so rapid that even the rocks struggle to record it. Geologists tell us that the Cambrian explosion lasted somewhere between 20 and 30 million years long, in human terms, but geologically brief. Within that span, nearly every major blueprint for animal life emerged. To put that in perspective, humans and chimpanzees diverged around 6 million years ago, and we're still recognizably similar. But in the Cambrian, a mere fraction of that time gave rise to every body plan on Earth, from worms to vertebrates to creatures so strange we still don't have names for their kind. It was not just evolution speeding up, it was evolution reinventing itself. How could such acceleration happen? The first clue might lie in the environment itself. The Precambrian Earth had been a place of extreme ice ages that froze the oceans, volcanic eruptions that shrouded the world in haze, long stretches of chemical quiet broken by bursts of oxygenation. These cycles may have acted like trials, preparing life for complexity. Each global freeze or flood would have wiped the slate clean, forcing survivors to adapt in new ways. By the time stability returned, the evolutionary engine was primed, ready to explode into forms that could finally take advantage of calm seas and abundant oxygen. Still, even knowing this, there's a sense that the Cambrian was more than environmental coincidence. Some scientists speak of a genetic threshold, a point at which life's internal code reached enough sophistication to allow creativity. Once multicellular organisms learned how to regulate development through genes, the possibilities multiplied exponentially. Cells could specialize, form organs, coordinate into structures that acted with purpose. It was as if life had suddenly been handed a new language, one capable of writing stories far more intricate than before. The Hox genes, which control the layout of body plans, appeared during this time. They are like blueprints, determining where heads and tails go, how limbs are placed, how symmetry unfolds. Before their emergence, organisms were limited to simple repetition segments and shapes without much variation. Afterward, the world filled with eyes, spines, shells, and the first nervous systems. But that explanation, while elegant, opens another mystery. Why did this genetic toolkit appear when it did? For billions of years, life had been refining the same few strategies. Then suddenly, it leapt forward, almost as if anticipating the future. Some evolutionary theorists call this phenomenon punctuated equilibrium, the idea that long periods of stability are broken by bursts of rapid change. But even that doesn't quite capture the wonder of the Cambrian moment, because this was not a local adaptation. It was global, synchronized, as if the entire planet participated in a single act of invention. Perhaps that's what makes the Cambrian explosion feel so uncanny. It behaves like a collective awakening. Every corner of the sea, from the shallow coastal shelves to the deeper basins, began producing new forms almost simultaneously. It's as though life itself had grown restless with simplicity, yearning for more ways to exist. Some thinkers see this as evidence of a self-organizing system, one that, under the right conditions, naturally tends toward complexity. Others, more philosophical, wonder whether life contains within it an instinct to explore. Maybe it was not random at all, but inevitable that once life reached a certain richness, it would bloom into diversity the way a tree bursts into leaves each spring. The Cambrian also challenges our sense of how time itself works in evolution. We often imagine progress as linear, a steady climb from simple to complex. But the fossil record suggests something more rhythmic, like breathing. Long pauses of equilibrium, then quick inhalations of creation. Maybe evolution is not a straight path but a pulse, an oscillation between stability and change. The Cambrian would be one of its deepest breaths in. And perhaps there have been others since, smaller echoes repeating through history, the rise of mammals, the spread of flowering plants, even the emergence of human consciousness. Each one a miniature explosion, following the same pattern written in the deep past. If we look closer, we can see that time in evolution is not measured by years but by possibilities. The Cambrian explosion wasn't simply a matter of organisms appearing faster, it was a broadening of what could exist. Once a few key innovations, eyes, muscles, nervous systems entered the picture, the combinatorial possibilities multiplied. Every adaptation inspired another, like branches growing outward from a single stem. Life became recursive, inventing not just forms but the ability to invent. Yet, for all the beauty in that story, there remains a question that science can describe but not entirely answer. Why did the universe choose that moment? What unseen clock struck that hour, releasing complexity across the globe? Was it merely chance, the sum of chemistry and coincidence? Or was it something more, something that hints at a direction, a momentum built into the cosmos itself? If you let the mind wander, it's tempting to imagine the Cambrian as a kind of cosmic experiment. Perhaps not one conducted by a hand or an intention as we know it, but by the universe's own laws seeking to know themselves. For billions of years, the cosmos had been building stars, planets, and oceans. The ingredients for life had gathered slowly, patiently. And then, in that warm, mineral-rich water, the bouvin, the experiment began to express itself in complexity. If the goal of matter is to learn how to feel, to perceive, to know, then the Cambrian explosion was one of its greatest successes. You can almost feel the tension between chaos and design in those fossils. The strange asymmetry of early creatures, the mismatched limbs and alien features, they look like drafts, rough sketches of ideas trying themselves out. Life was exploring the parameters of form, testing what worked and what didn't. And once those successful patterns were found, they persisted. Every living creature today, including us, carries echoes of those first experiments in our bodies. Our eyes are built on the same logic as those ancient trilobites. Our nervous systems trace their ancestry to those first primitive networks that learned to sense the world. The blueprint remains, updated but recognizable. When scientists measure the layers of Cambrian rock, they're not just dating fossils, they're tracing the rhythm of creativity itself. Each stratum marks a pulse, a new burst of design. It's humbling to realize that the world beneath our feet is not only made of stone but also of memory. Each layer whispers the same truth, that life has always been restless, always reaching for new ways to exist. If the Cambrian explosion was nature's great awakening, then perhaps the puzzle of time is simply our way of asking how long it takes for a universe to notice itself. Maybe it takes billions of years. Maybe it takes as long as it must, until the conditions are right for awareness to bloom. From that perspective, the Cambrian wasn't an anomaly. It was a continuation of a much larger process, one that began with atoms forming stars and will continue as long as consciousness finds new ways to emerge. When we look back on that age, we're really looking inward, at the moment our story began, because the patterns that unfolded in those ancient seas didn't end when the trilobites vanished. They continued, flowing through every living being that came after, each of us another iteration of that same experiment. So the puzzle of time, in the end, might not be about how quickly life changed, but about how patiently the universe waited for that change to arrive. Billions of years of quiet preparation, followed by a single luminous surge of becoming. Maybe that's how everything happens, not all at once, but in waves. Silence, then song. Darkness, then light. Stillness, then motion. And if you listen closely enough, you can still feel that rhythm pulsing through the world today, a quiet heartbeat echoing from the depths of time, reminding us that we are the latest verse in a story that began long before the first creatures opened their eyes and saw the ocean around them. 4. Whispers of design. The Cambrian world must have shimmered with a kind of new awareness. Every creature, every glinting shell and flicker of motion was part of a symphony that had only just begun. For the first time, life was not merely surviving, it was experimenting, trying, failing, evolving. The ocean was alive, not just with forms, but with intentions. And to stand at the edge of that great unfolding, even in imagination, is to sense something extraordinary. A faint whisper running through the currents, a suggestion that maybe, just maybe, there was more at play than chance alone. When people talk about design in nature, the conversation often grows heated, as if the word itself threatens to tip us from science into myth. But tonight, we can let the word soften. We can let it mean not the intervention of some distant hand, but the presence of pattern, the quiet coherence that seems to run through everything from the shape of a snowflake to the spiral of a shell. Perhaps the Cambrian explosion wasn't a miracle in the divine sense, but it does feel miraculous in the natural one. Something unseen moved through those seas, not a being, but a principle, a tendency toward structure, toward beauty, toward complexity that appears again and again wherever life takes root. Imagine watching one of those ancient organisms drift past. Its body, delicate and translucent, would seem almost too fragile to survive, and yet inside that fragility was a system of astonishing precision cells, communicating through signals, proteins folding into exact shapes, genetic codes, orchestrating every motion. Each organism was a small universe, self-contained, yet connected to the greater one around it. That unity of purpose, that harmony of parts, feels almost intentional, even if we know it arises through natural processes. Maybe that's the real whisper of design, the way nature behaves as though it knows what it's doing. When scientists examine the Cambrian explosion, they often speak in terms of cause and effect. Oxygen levels rising, genetic mechanisms evolving, ecosystems interacting. But beyond those mechanisms, there's a subtler question. Why does the universe produce order at all? Why should atoms, left to themselves, eventually arrange into molecules, and those molecules into living systems capable of thought? The physical laws don't require it, and yet the result is everywhere we look. Some thinkers have suggested that the universe is not indifferent but participatory, that it contains within it a bias toward complexity, toward the emergence of structure and life. If that's true, then the Cambrian explosion was not an accident, but a milestone along a much older path, one that began when the first stars forged the elements of life in their cores. To think this way doesn't make the Cambrian any less scientific. It only deepens the wonder, because even if no mind guided evolution, the process itself behaves as though guided. Random mutations, shaped by the steady pressure of natural selection, produce organisms of breathtaking intricacy, creatures that see, feel, and navigate worlds that didn't exist before them. There's something almost poetic in that, chaos giving birth to order, randomness composing beauty. It's as though the universe has been writing, in biology, the same story it tells in galaxies and stars, a story of patterns forming from turbulence, of symmetry emerging from noise. Consider the trilobite again. Its exoskeleton was not a simple armor, it was a masterpiece of engineering. Its eyes, made of calcite, were capable of focusing light like glass lenses. Its joints allowed movement both flexible and strong. The trilobite didn't know it was designed, but its body followed the same mathematical principles that govern crystals and shells today. Those principles, symmetry, repetition, proportion, appear wherever complexity thrives. They are the language of life's construction, and they seem to whisper that form itself is a kind of intelligence. Some scientists, when faced with this elegance, refer to it as emergent design. It doesn't imply a designer, only the tendency of systems to organize themselves under the right conditions. In the Cambrian, the conditions were perfect: a stable climate, nutrient-rich waters, and an abundance of oxygen. But perhaps there was something deeper still, a resonance between environment and potential, a harmony waiting to be played. When the moment arrived, the music began. And yet, there's an unease that lingers in the heart of every explanation. The Cambrian explosion feels too precise, too synchronous, as though an invisible conductor had raised a hand and the orchestra responded. What if that conductor wasn't a person or a god, but the universe's own internal rhythm? Physics, after all, is full of feedback loops, processes that build on themselves until complexity becomes inevitable. From that view, the Cambrian wasn't a deviation from nature, but its purest expression. The planet had reached a point where it could no longer contain the potential simmering within it. Life had to bloom. Still, when you hold the fossil from that time, when you trace the outline of a trilobite's shell or the delicate fronds of an ancient sea creature, it's hard not to feel as though you're touching intention. Not a human kind of intention with motive or foresight, but a cosmic one, something woven into the very fabric of existence. The atoms in that stone were once part of something that lived, that moved, that sought the light. And those same atoms, recycled through time, now form the world around us, even the cells of our own bodies. Perhaps the whisper of design is nothing more than that recognition, that everything connects, that nothing is wasted, that the pattern continues. Philosophers and scientists have long wrestled with this tension between randomness and order. Some call it the fine-tuning problem, others the anthropic principle. Why do the constants of physics seem so delicately balanced that life can exist at all? Why does water behave in ways that make biology possible? Why do the laws of chemistry produce complexity instead of chaos? The Cambrian explosion brings those questions close to home. It was the moment when balance tipped toward abundance, when life discovered the full range of what it could be. If you were to stand on a Cambrian shore, you might not see the grand sweep of this transformation. You'd see small things, shadows flickering in shallow water, shells glinting in sunlight. But beneath that surface, the entire planet was reconfiguring itself. Ecosystems formed for the first time, linking predator and prey, plant and detritus, oxygen and carbon. The web of life began to weave itself, each strand dependent on the others. There's something sacred in that interconnectedness. It's not that someone built it, it's that it built itself, guided by laws that seem to know how to create harmony from difference. Some biologists refer to this process as self-organization, the way order emerges naturally from the interplay of forces. But when you watch that it unfold across billions of years, it's hard not to hear the word design in a softer, more poetic sense. The world designs itself constantly. Rivers carve their own paths, coral builds its own reefs, forests shape their own climates. In that light, The Cambrian explosion wasn't the arrival of design, but its revelation. Life had been designing all along, silently, at the microbial scale. The Cambrian was simply when that quiet artistry became visible. If you allow your imagination to drift, you might picture that moment not as an event, but as a realization, the Earth coming into focus, like an image sharpening in light. For the first time, the planet could see itself, sense itself, through the eyes of its new inhabitants. Perhaps that awareness was the point all along, the slow, inevitable evolution of perception. In that sense, the Cambrian explosion wasn't just biological, it was spiritual. It was the first awakening, the first murmur of consciousness woven into matter. Whether that whisper came from physics, from chance, or from something beyond, we may never know. But we can feel it still in the symmetry of a seashell, in the rhythm of a heartbeat, in the intricate balance of ecosystems that trace their lineage back to those ancient seas. Everything that breathes today carries a fragment of that design, that memory of awakening. Maybe that's what makes the Cambrian explosion so haunting. It reminds us that creation is not confined to a single moment in the past. It's happening all the time, in every cell dividing, in every idea forming, in every heartbeat. The same impulse that shaped trilobites and coral reefs is still at work in us. We are living echoes of that ancient whisper, still unfolding, still designing, still dreaming the universe forward. And as you imagine those ancient waters now lit by the soft glow of a newborn sun, filled with life discovering itself, you might feel a strange sense of recognition. Not that you've been there, but that something within you remembers. Because somewhere deep in our genetic code, in the spirals of our DNA, the memory of that moment remains. The first time the universe looked at its own reflection and realized with quiet wonder that it was alive. 5. The tools of life. Every great transformation in the history of Earth begins quietly, with a few simple ingredients and an immense patience. The Cambrian explosion was no exception. It might look sudden to us, a miraculous bloom of eyes, shells, and movement, but beneath that apparent speed was a far deeper story. A story of tools, not the tools forged by hands, but those written into the very essence of life itself. The genetic instruments, molecular mechanisms, and cellular rhythms that made evolution possible were already there, waiting, silent and invisible, until the right moment arrived to awaken them. Imagine life as a craftsman, not of metal or stone, but of forms. For billions of years before the Cambrian, it practiced in miniature. It learned how to build membranes, how to copy molecules, how to feed on light and minerals. Its early tools were crude but ingenious enzymes that could cut and paste bits of genetic code, proteins that folded themselves into precise shapes, tiny engines inside cells that could harness chemical energy. Each invention was an act of quiet brilliance, refined over eons, and when the Cambrian dawn came, those hidden tools were ready. They didn't create new life from nothing. They simply used what already existed in new, astonishing ways. One of the greatest of these tools was information itself, the code of DNA. It's strange to think that every creature that has ever lived, from trilobite to human, speaks the same language of life. 4 chemical letters, A, T, C, and G, arranged in infinite patterns, carrying the instructions for every cell, every organ, every thought. During the Cambrian, life didn't discover new letters, it discovered grammar. The Hox, genes, those quiet architects of anatomy, began to orchestrate how the body was built. They told the embryo where to grow limbs, how to shape a head, where to form eyes and spines. With that, the possibilities multiplied. Suddenly, life had the means to sculpt itself with precision. The oceans became a studio filled with experiments, each creature a new design composed from the same simple code. It's tempting to imagine evolution as blind, stumbling from one form to another. But in truth, it's more like a system learning its own rules. Every mutation, every variation, is a test, a question posed to the universe. Will this work? Will this endure? And nature answers patiently, keeping what succeeds and discarding what does not. Over time, this feedback loop creates not just survival, but ingenuity. The creatures of the Cambrian were not accidents. They were the first results of life's long apprenticeship in adaptation. Think of a trilobite's compound eye, tiny facets, each one a perfect lens carved from crystal, arranged to capture light from every direction. Or the body of Anomalocaris, sleek and flexible, designed for swift motion through water. These were not the clumsy forms of a beginner, they were masterpieces, honed by billions of years of molecular experimentation. The tools that made them, the proteins, the genes, the developmental blueprints, were as elegant as the creatures themselves. Evolution had, in a sense, built the perfect toolkit before it began to use it in earnest. But what makes this period so mysterious is how quickly those tools found expression. For billions of years, the machinery of life existed but changed little. Then, almost overnight, it was as though 1,000 instruments began to play in harmony. The question that has haunted biologists for decades is not just how life changed, but why it changed so dramatically then. Why did the same genetic mechanisms that once produced simplicity suddenly produce complexity? Some suggest it was simply a threshold effect. Once a certain level of genetic sophistication was reached, diversity became inevitable. Others point to environmental triggers, oxygen levels, climate stability, chemical nutrients, yet there's something uncanny about how neatly it all aligns, as if a vast clock had struck the right hour and everything responded. Maybe life itself sensed readiness, the way seeds sense spring. The tools of life are not purely mechanical, they're relational. DNA doesn't act alone, it interacts with its environment, responding to cues of light, temperature, and chemistry. Perhaps in those ancient seas, a convergence occurred, a perfect harmony between internal potential and external opportunity. When that balance was achieved, evolution began to compose its grandest symphony. Another way to think of these tools is as memory. DNA is not just a set of instructions, it's a history, a layered archive of everything life has ever learned. Each generation adds to it, modifies it, passes it along. When the Cambrian creatures emerged, they carried within them the entire record of the world that came before the single-celled ancestors, the microbial colonies, the first experiments in multicellularity. Nothing was lost. It was all encoded, waiting to be reinterpreted. Evolution then was less a process of invention than of remembering. That memory still lives in us. The same molecules that built trilobites build our bodies today. The same patterns that shaped the first eyes shape ours. The same proteins that folded in ancient oceans fold now inside your cells as you listen to this. Life does not start over. It continues, adapting its tools to new challenges, refining old solutions in new ways. The Cambrian Explosion may seem remote, but in truth, we are its continuation, its latest expression. The tools of life also carry a paradox. They are both simple and unfathomably complex. 4 nucleotides form the basis of DNA, yet from that simplicity arises everything from coral reefs to human thought. It's like an artist using only 4 colors to paint every landscape in the world. The Cambrian Explosion was when nature discovered its palette, and once it began to mix, it never stopped. Some scientists compare genetic evolution to computation, self-correcting, iterative, guided by feedback loops. Others see it more like art, an unfolding improvisation with no end in sight. Either way, the tools themselves are astonishingly efficient. They allow life to explore possibilities faster than chance alone would predict. Every cell is a miniature laboratory, every generation a new experiment. It's easy to see why some call evolution the mindless genius. It behaves with purpose, even without a plan. And yet, one wonders, is there really no mind at all in the process? Could intention be built into the structure of the universe itself, encoded not in genes but in laws of physics that favor life's emergence? When you look at the intricacy of even the simplest cell, the way it replicates, repairs, and sustains itself, it's hard not to feel that something profound is at work. Whether we call it chance, necessity, or design, it operates with astonishing grace. The Cambrian creatures didn't know they were participating in something eternal, but in a sense, they were. The tools of life that animated them are the same ones that still animate us. The DNA that coiled in their cells is the same molecule that coils in yours. Across 500 million years, the thread remains unbroken. The Cambrian Explosion was not the invention of life's tools. It was their unveiling, the moment the quiet machinery of existence began to express itself in full color and form. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and thought drifts like a tide, it's possible to feel a kinship with those first creatures. They too were exploring, adapting, learning what their tools could do, The sea that cradled them still covers most of the planet, and in that water, the same chemistry continues. Every breath you take, every heartbeat, every flicker of thought is the echo of that first awakening. The tools of life still at work, refining, experimenting, dreaming forward. Perhaps that's the real story of the Cambrian. Not an explosion, but a revelation. Life did not simply appear, it revealed the tools it had been shaping in secret for eons. The code, the patterns, the symmetries, they were all there, waiting for the moment when the world was ready to hear their music. And once the song began, it never truly stopped. It plays still, in coral reefs and rainforests, in cities and in you. The same quiet harmony that began 500 million years ago when the tools of life found their voice in the ocean's deep and endless blue. 6. Messages in the code. If you hold a drop of seawater beneath a microscope even today, you can see something faintly miraculous. Tiny shapes move through the glass, twisting, dividing, pulsing with life. Each one is a miniature universe, a system of astonishing order, performing the quiet rituals that sustain existence. But the real wonder isn't what you can see, it's what you can't. Inside each of those organisms lies a library so vast that, if written out, its contents would fill millions of pages. That library is DNA, the language of life. And in the Cambrian seas, that language began to speak in ways it never had before. The story of the Cambrian Explosion is often told as a story of fossils, of shells and limbs and the sudden appearance of complexity. But perhaps it was also a story of communication, a moment when life began to write to itself in new forms of meaning. Every cell, every organism, carries within it not just instructions for survival, but the memory of everything that came before. The DNA molecule is not static. It's a message written and rewritten over billions of years. It mutates, adapts, and learns. It remembers. And when we look at it closely, it's hard not to wonder whether, somewhere inside that code, there might be more than chemistry. Perhaps a kind of whisper, an echo of intention. DNA has been called many things. A blueprint, a recipe, a script. But none of those metaphors quite capture its depth. It's not simply a set of directions, it's a story told across time. Every sequence of genes carries layers of meaning, shaped by survival, refined by chance, and sculpted by the invisible hand of selection. What if, hidden in that story, there are messages from the earliest days of life? Not messages written by hands or minds, but by processes so ancient and consistent that they almost seem deliberate. In the Cambrian, life began experimenting with its own language. The same 4 chemical letters, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, were arranged in new sequences, generating forms that had never existed before. A change in a single gene might turn a simple worm into a creature with segments and armor. A small variation could produce an eye, a fin, a spine. DNA became a poet, recombining its letters into stanzas of bone and muscle, vision and instinct. Each organism was a verse in the growing poem of life. The question that lingers, however softly, is this. Why does DNA seem to write with such artistry? The molecule itself does not think, yet its creations reveal patterns of logic, symmetry, and grace. It's as though evolution is composing a long, unfolding message, one that begins in the depths of time and continues through every living being. Maybe that message is simple. Continue, adapt, endure. But perhaps there's more to it than that. Perhaps the very structure of DNA, its double helix, spiraling endlessly inward, is not just a coincidence of chemistry, but a symbol of continuity, of connection between all living things. Scientists can trace our genetic ancestry back through eons, through fish and microbes and the first self-replicating molecules. In a sense, DNA is the oldest surviving artifact on Earth, one that has never stopped being alive. The patterns that evolved during the Cambrian explosion still run through us, unchanged, like ancient lines of code still executing their purpose. The genes that once built trilobite eyes now help build ours. The proteins that assembled shells are echoed in our bones. The same sequences that made the first nerves possible still light up when you think, dream, or remember. To call DNA a code is accurate, but it might also be too small a word. It's not a message written once, but one that writes itself, endlessly revised by every generation. It's recursive, self-editing, self-aware in a sense that transcends any single organism. Each creature is both reader and author, interpreting and rewriting the text as it lives. When the Cambrian explosion happened, it wasn't just a burst of new life, it was a burst of new communication. The genetic language itself became fluent in complexity. Life learned to speak in full sentences instead of single words. There's a peculiar comfort in thinking of this, because if DNA is a message, then we are all part of a conversation that began billions of years ago. Every plant, every insect, every human is a continuation of that dialogue. The seaweeds and sponges of the Cambrian were its first whispers, testing the vocabulary of being. The trilobites added punctuation. The predators wrote verbs of motion. The soft-bodied forms contributed metaphors of resilience. And in time, we arrived creatures who could not only carry the message but reflect on its meaning. Perhaps that was always part of the story, that one day, life would become conscious enough to ask where it came from, and in doing so, continue the conversation in a new form. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear it not in words, but in patterns. The way the same spirals repeat in galaxies, in seashells, in storms. The way the ratios of leaves and limbs follow, mathematical, rhythms that also govern light and sound. Nature's code is fractal, recursive, endlessly self-similar. It's as if the universe is fluent in a single language, and life is just one of its dialects. During the Cambrian, that language reached a new level of articulation. It began to describe not only how to exist, but how to perceive, how to interact, how to remember. What's most humbling is that we can now read fragments of that code. When scientists sequence DNA, they are, in a sense, deciphering ancient writing sentences composed 500 million years ago, still intact inside our cells. The patterns of those sequences reveal not just ancestry but possibility. They tell us how evolution might continue, how life might adapt to future worlds. It's like finding an unfinished manuscript that keeps writing itself as you read it. Some thinkers have even speculated that DNA might contain a kind of universal signature, a mathematical or informational pattern that transcends biology. It's a bold idea, and a controversial one, but it arises from wonder, the recognition that something so precise and enduring might hint at an intelligence beyond randomness. Not an intelligence outside nature, but one within it, woven into the structure of matter and energy themselves. Perhaps intelligence is not a byproduct of evolution, but its foundation. Perhaps the message in the code is simply this: life knows itself. Of course, science prefers caution. DNA, after all, can be explained through chemistry and physics. Its patterns arise through necessity and natural law, yet even those laws are remarkable. Why should the universe be arranged in such a way that matter can encode information, that molecules can remember? The fact that it happens at all is its own kind of poetry. Whether we call it design or emergence, chance or intention, the result is the same. A molecule that holds the memory of the world and passes it forward endlessly. In the Cambrian seas, that cycle began to accelerate. Life became self-reflective in structure, though not yet in thought. Each organism carried within it the same chemical script, slightly edited, slightly improved. The diversity we see in fossils is not just a story of shapes, it's a story of syntax, of how the language of life expanded to express new ideas. Every new species was a new sentence in that unfolding narrative. Some were brief, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Others lasted millions of years, their words echoing through generations until they evolved into something new. Even extinction, in this view, becomes part of the message. When a lineage ends, its information is not lost. Fragments remain, repurposed, recombined. The code remembers, and through that memory, life learns. The Cambrian explosion might not have been a single event, but a realization, a moment when life discovered that it could communicate across time, not just through reproduction but through transformation. And so here we are, 500 million years later, still reading and rewriting that same message. Every cell in your body contains it. Every breath you take is part of it. When you look at your reflection, you are seeing not just a human being, but a story billions of years old. A continuation of the message that first shimmered in the ancient seas. The Cambrian explosion may have been when life learned to shape itself, but it was also when life began to speak. If you close your eyes and imagine that distant ocean, filled with strange, luminous creatures, You might feel the faint pulse of that conversation continuing still. The code whispers softly, even now. It speaks in the hum of your heartbeat, in the rhythm of waves against the shore, in the quiet certainty that life, whatever its form, is never alone. It is always connected to what was, to what is, to what will be. The message never ends. It only changes its language, waiting for each new generation of listeners to discover once again that the universe has been speaking all along. 7. The Ocean Laboratory. If we could step back in time and hover above the Cambrian seas, we might not immediately recognize the world as ours. The continents were bare and uninviting, scorched by sunlight and whipped by winds. There were no forests to soften the horizon, no birds to carve the air with motion. All the real drama unfolded below the surface, in the vast blue where sunlight dwindled into shadow. The ocean was the laboratory of existence, an immense breathing experiment that had been running for billions of years, and during the Cambrian, it reached one of its most astonishing breakthroughs. It's tempting to think of the ocean as a single, unified world, but in truth it was a universe of many layers. Near the surface, warm, sunlit waters teemed with microscopic life. Plankton and algae, capturing sunlight, turning it into energy. Deeper down, where light became dim and strange, other forms flourished. Soft-bodied creatures gliding through the dark, their bodies glowing faintly with bioluminescence, their limbs delicate and experimental. And far below that, in the cold blackness near the ocean floor, life gathered around volcanic vents, creatures that needed no sunlight at all, drawing energy instead from the Earth's heat. It was a planet-sized experiment in chemistry, testing every combination of temperature, pressure, and element to see what life could become. If you could move among those creatures, it would feel almost like wandering through a dream. The water would be thick with motion, tiny cilia beating, fins fluttering, strange appendages drifting in the current. Everywhere you looked, something new was unfolding. One moment, a transparent worm-like shape would undulate past, its body flashing with refracted light. The next, a hard-shelled animal would scuttle across the seafloor, leaving trails in the sediment like the first handwriting of a world learning to record itself. Predators darted after. Prey. Scavengers sifted through the leftovers. It was chaotic, but not random. There was a kind of order in the movement, a rhythm that spoke of adaptation and balance. To call it a laboratory isn't just a metaphor, it's almost literal. The ocean in the Cambrian was a place of constant experimentation. Every organism was a hypothesis, every mutation a test. Some designs succeeded, spreading quickly through the seas. Others vanished, leaving only faint impressions in mud that would harden into fossilized pages of history. What makes this time so beautiful and so haunting is how open-ended it was. Evolution had not yet decided what life should look like. The rules of anatomy were still being written. Creatures with multiple eyes, backward limbs, or bodies shaped like ribbons coexisted without hierarchy. Nature had not yet settled on symmetry, or balance, or proportion. It was still playing. When scientists study Cambrian fossils today, they are peering into that playground of possibility. In places like the Burgess Shale in Canada, or the Chengjiang Formation in China, entire ecosystems have been preserved in exquisite detail. There we see the prototypes of nearly every animal lineage that would ever exist. Early arthropods, sponges, mollusks, chordates. But we also see the failures, the evolutionary drafts that were tried and abandoned. Each fossil is a snapshot from a long-running experiment, a record of nature's curiosity. What makes this so profound is that the ocean itself was the perfect environment for such experimentation. Water is forgiving. It cushions, supports, allows shapes that would collapse under gravity to thrive. It carries oxygen and nutrients, dissolves waste, and mediates temperature. The sea is both cradle and canvas, letting life test ideas before committing them to land. During the Cambrian, it must have felt like the entire ocean was alive with invention, each wave carrying new possibilities. But there's another way to look at. Maybe the ocean wasn't just the setting for life's experiment. Maybe it was the experimenter. The chemistry of seawater is intricate and self-balancing. Minerals dissolve, gases exchange, energy flows through currents and tides. It behaves like a living system, responding to the organisms within it. When algae grew too abundant, oxygen levels rose, altering who could survive. When predators evolved, Prey species adapted, changing the ecosystem in return. Life and environment were not separate forces, they were partners in creation. The Cambrian explosion was not something that happened in the ocean, it was something the ocean itself did. That interdependence still exists today. Every breath of oxygen we take comes in part from marine microorganisms, descendants of the ones that flourished 500 million years ago. The ocean continues to regulate temperature, absorb carbon, and maintain the delicate chemistry that allows life to persist. The laboratory never closed. It only expanded, incorporating land and air into its grand experiment. During the Cambrian, though, the ocean's focus was pure invention. Every new structure, an eye, a limb, a shell, was a breakthrough. The development of hard exoskeletons changed everything. For the first time, creatures had protection, but also weight. They could dig, grasp, build. Movement became purposeful, and with it came behavior, hunting, hiding, choosing. In that moment, life transitioned from reaction to action. The laboratory had found a way to test not only form but will. Imagine one of those early predators gliding through the dim water. Its body is sleek, segmented, and lined with sensors. It detects the faint vibrations of nearby prey, propels itself forward with undulating fins, and captures its meal with a precision that seems almost intelligent. That simple act, one creature seeking another, was revolutionary. It introduced competition, awareness, and something like decision-making into the world. The experiment was no longer just physical, it had become psychological. The ocean, vast and ancient, must have felt alive with tension and possibility. Every encounter was a test of design, every survival a validation of a new idea. Over millions of years, these interactions shaped the evolutionary trajectory of all future life. Predators forced prey to adapt, and those adaptations, in turn, created new opportunities for innovation. Eyes became sharper, shells thicker, brains more complex. It was an endless feedback loop of creativity, a living engine of evolution. If you drift quietly in your imagination through those ancient waters, you might sense something familiar. That same engine still runs today, not only in ecosystems but in us. Human creativity follows the same pattern: experiment, failure, adaptation, success. Our technologies evolve the way bodies once did, through trial and refinement. Perhaps we too are part of the ocean's experiment, carried forward through time, exploring new frontiers of thought and form, just as the trilobites once explored movement and sight. The Cambrian Ocean reminds us that creation need not be linear. Progress is rarely a straight line. It's a web of attempts, a pattern of feedbacks and corrections. In that sense, the ocean's laboratory was never about perfection, it was about exploration. Each failed species contributed to the success of others. Each dead end enriched the chemistry of the sea, feeding the next generation of ideas. There is grace in that process, a quiet assurance that nothing in nature is truly wasted. It's easy to think of the Cambrian as something long finished, locked away in deep time, but its experiment never ended. We are still part of it, still living in the laboratory of Earth, still refining what it means to be alive. The same processes that shaped trilobites shape us: mutation, feedback, adaptation, imagination. The only difference is that our experiments are now conscious. We build with intention, though the deeper rhythm that guides us is the same one that pulsed through those ancient seas. Perhaps that's why the ocean still feels sacred. It remembers. Every drop carries the memory of life's first great awakening. Every current is a continuation of that ancient flow of possibility. When you stand at the shore and watch the waves roll in, you're witnessing the same rhythm that shaped the first eyes, the first hearts, the first awareness. The laboratory never closed, it simply grew quieter, subtler, but it still hums with the same patient curiosity. And maybe that's what the Cambrian explosion really was: not an explosion at all, but a conversation. The earth, the ocean, and life itself began to speak to one another, to exchange ideas in the language of adaptation. That dialogue continues now, through coral reefs and forests, through wind and weather, through us. The experiment is ongoing. The ocean is still at work, still dreaming in the slow language of waves, still asking the same question it posed 500 million years ago. What else might life become? 8. Visitors of time. If you could walk along the shores of the Cambrian seas, Watching the first true animals drift and scuttle through the shallows, you might feel something uncanny, a sense of presence, as if someone or something unseen were observing alongside you. It is the kind of feeling that sometimes arises when the world is too quiet, when nature seems too intentional, when beauty feels too precise to be a coincidence. The Cambrian explosion, in all its suddenness and intricacy, evokes that same feeling. For 500 million years, life had been small, slow, and simple. Then, in the span of a few geological moments, the planet was filled with structure, motion, and awareness. Some have wondered, softly and without conclusion, whether something or someone might have been watching too. To imagine that life might have been nudged, seeded, or accelerated by intelligence is not to abandon science. It is to let imagination stretch into the silence between facts, into the spaces that evidence cannot yet fill. The Cambrian period leaves room for that wonder. It is as if the fossil record contains a gap large enough for speculation to enter quietly, not to claim certainty, but to whisper possibilities. Perhaps life's sudden bloom was entirely natural, driven by chemistry and competition. Or perhaps the ocean, for a brief time, was visited not by travellers in ships or forms we could recognize, but by something more abstract. A consciousness older than stars, a pattern that moves through time rather than through space. Some thinkers have entertained the idea that life on Earth might not have started here at all. The theory of panspermia suggests that the building blocks of biology, or even living microbes, may have arrived on comets or asteroids from elsewhere in the cosmos. If that is true, then every breath of air you take might contain molecules that once drifted between stars. The Cambrian explosion could have been a continuation of that same journey, a second wave of seeding, when dormant instructions awakened and unfolded in the seas. What if those ancient oceans were not only fertile ground, but the destination of a message sent across light years, a message written not in sound or symbol, but in genes? It's an idea that invites awe more than belief. Even the most skeptical mind can feel its poetry. The universe is vast, and time stretches beyond comprehension. In such immensity, it seems almost inevitable that life, once begun, would seek to spread, to plant itself in every corner of possibility. Perhaps the Cambrian explosion was not an isolated event, but one of countless awakenings across the cosmos, a synchronized flowering of life wherever conditions were right. In that sense, we might all be participants in a grand, interstellar experiment, each world, each species, a chapter in a cosmic narrative still being written. But if we entertain the thought that something guided this turning point, we must also consider what form such guidance could take. It may not be technological, not metallic ships or deliberate interventions, but something woven into the structure of existence itself. Perhaps the visitors were not travellers from elsewhere, but forces from within, manifestations of intelligence intrinsic to the universe. Maybe consciousness is not confined to minds, but diffused through matter, occasionally focusing itself in certain times and places to steer creation forward. The Cambrian explosion, from that view, might have been one such focusing a moment when awareness concentrated in the ocean, nudging evolution toward complexity. You can think of it like a tide of thought moving through matter. The Earth, after billions of years of quiet preparation, reached a point of readiness. The conditions of the oceans, the chemistry of life, the stability of the climate, all aligned perfectly, like instruments in tune. And then the tide came in, not from the stars perhaps, but from within the cosmos itself. A pulse of order, a wave of potential. Life responded, as if remembering instructions that had always been there. It's tempting to imagine this visitation not as an intrusion, but as a reunion. Maybe the intelligence that shaped life did not arrive from outside, but awoke from within the planet, the way consciousness awakens within a brain after long development. Perhaps the Cambrian explosion was the Earth's first thought, expressed through living form. The planet had gathered enough complexity to reflect itself, and in that reflection, awareness began. The visitors were not aliens in the traditional sense, they were us, in the most ancient possible way. Still, the idea of visitors, real or metaphorical, has a strange comfort to it. It suggests we are not alone in the long arc of evolution. It proposes that life, in all its wonder, may be part of a shared cosmic project. And if that's true, then we are living evidence of that continuity. The same intelligence that once guided trilobites and strange Cambrian predators continues its work now through us, shaping new technologies, new patterns, new awareness. We are not separate from that unfolding. We are its latest expression. Consider how evolution seems to mirror creativity. Both follow the same rhythm: variation, selection, refinement. Both thrive on mistakes that lead to breakthroughs. Both turn chaos into beauty. The Cambrian seas were full of such creativity, an entire planet composing in the language of form. Some designs failed immediately, others lasted for hundreds of millions of years. Yet even failure had meaning. Every extinction cleared space for something new, just as every erased line in a sketch brings the drawing closer to completion. If intelligence was present, it was not dictating outcomes but encouraging experimentation, allowing the process to discover itself. And perhaps that is what the visitors were: time itself, experimenting through us. When we look at the Cambrian explosion, we are not just looking into the past, we are looking at a conversation between life and time, between potential and realization. Every fossil, every genetic lineage is a sentence in that conversation. Life writes, time edits, the universe reads, and the dialogue continues, endlessly revising its meaning. It's easy, from our human vantage point, to imagine visitors as beings like ourselves, curious, advanced, purposeful. But what if they were simply patterns of consciousness, passing through epochs as light passes through glass? What if they are not gone but still here, flowing quietly through the laws of physics, through the behavior of atoms, through the chemistry of life? The universe, after all, has a way of remembering itself. Its constants do not change, its equations endure. Perhaps what we call intelligence is simply the universe becoming aware of its own stability, its own coherence. If that's true, then the Cambrian explosion might have been one of the universe's great moments of self-recognition, a realization expressed through living creatures. When those first eyes opened underwater, seeing light for the first time, maybe the cosmos itself saw back. When those first nervous systems fired with sensation, perhaps awareness rippled outward, like sound across a great still pond. From that moment onward, perception became part of reality. The universe began to experience itself. And if the visitors of time are indeed woven into the process of life, then they never left. They are in every heartbeat, every cell division, every thought that emerges in the dark folds of a mind. They are the continuity that threads through history, linking the Cambrian seas to the modern world. We are not the inheritors of that intelligence. We are its continuation. Sometimes, late at night, when the sky is clear and the stars shimmer like reflections on deep water, it's easy to feel that presence again. The same quiet watching that once filled the Cambrian oceans now looks through us. We are both the observers and the observed, both the experiment and the experimenter. Whether the visitors came from beyond the stars or from within the depths of time, they are still here, written into our atoms, dreaming through our minds. And so, as we drift forward through our own age of transformation, we echo that ancient awakening. The experiment continues, the conversation deepens, and perhaps the visitors, whoever or whatever they are, watch still, not as strangers, but as parts of ourselves we have yet to remember. The Cambrian explosion may have been their arrival, or perhaps it was our own. Either way, it was the moment the universe began to look at itself with wonder, and in that gaze, everything changed. 9. Natural doesn't mean accidental. There's a word we use so often that we forget how soft and uncertain it truly is: natural. We say it to mean ordinary, unplanned, untouched by intention. But when we look closely at the world, the line between natural and purposeful begins to blur. What is natural? After all, in a universe where matter organizes itself into stars, where chemistry gives rise to consciousness, where random motion produces beauty that seems to border on design, the Cambrian explosion challenges us to rethink that word. It was, by every measurable standard, a natural event, an unfolding of biology and environment. Yet when we stand before the fossil record and see how suddenly life bloomed into complexity, the sense of accident begins to feel too small. Perhaps natural does not mean without meaning. Perhaps nature, in its quiet persistence, has always been purposeful in ways we can feel but not define. If we were to drift back into the Cambrian seas and look around, we would see this paradox everywhere. Creatures shaped by blind chance move with the elegance of intention. Patterns that arise from chaos settle into harmony. Trilobites scurry across the ocean floor, their movements almost choreographed. Predators glide through dim waters with precision and grace. Every fin, every spine, every flicker of motion seems to fit, as though drawn by a careful hand, and yet no designer hovered above those ancient oceans. There were no plans, no blueprints, only the slow conversation between matter and energy, trial and error, success and extinction. Still, the result feels deliberate, as though the universe itself were expressing a kind of art. We often think of life as something that happens within the universe. But what if life is the universe, an inevitable pattern written into the fabric of reality? The laws of physics don't merely allow life, they seem to invite it. Carbon bonds with versatility, water dissolves and transports, light fuels reactions, and gravity holds it all together in balance. These are coincidences so perfect they almost defy the word. When the conditions are right, atoms do not just sit quietly, they begin to organize, to build, to remember. The Cambrian Explosion could be seen as one of those moments when the underlying intelligence of nature revealed itself not through miracle, but through process. In that sense, the Cambrian seas might have been less a stage for an accident than a revelation of inevitability. Complexity was always possible, waiting behind the curtain of time. When the curtain lifted, when oxygen filled the water, when the genetic machinery matured, when ecosystems stabilized, life did not hesitate. It rushed forward, as though following instructions written into the heart of reality. The trilobite's eye, the nautiloid's shell, the first nervous systems, all of them seem like ideas whose time had simply arrived. This notion that natural processes can appear guided without being guided has always fascinated both scientists and philosophers. Some call it self-organization, others describe it as emergent order, the tendency of systems to create structure spontaneously. Snowflakes form intricate patterns from the simple laws of crystallization. Rivers carve fractal networks across landscapes. Lightning branches through air with mathematical precision. None of these things are planned, yet all of them seem to obey a quiet aesthetic, as if the universe prefers beauty. The Cambrian Explosion might be the biological equivalent of that same principle, a natural unfolding so graceful it feels intentional. Perhaps the word natural itself has always been too narrow. We imagine nature as separate from purpose, from awareness, from intelligence. But what if intelligence is simply one of nature's expressions? The same physical laws that build galaxies also build neurons. The same energy that fuels the stars fuels thought. When we separate the natural from the meaningful, we create a false divide, one that the Cambrian Explosion seems to dissolve. In that ancient bloom, all of life, we see randomness and purpose intertwined, the chaos of mutation sculpted by the calm consistency of natural law. It is strange to realize that what we call random may only be unpredictable from our limited view. Imagine standing on a beach, watching the waves. They appear chaotic, each crest different, each pattern fleeting. But step back far enough, and you see the rhythm, the tide, the pull of the moon, the planetary dance that gives rise to what seems like chance. Evolution may work the same way. From the small perspective of genes and fossils, it looks like randomness and accident. From the broader view of the universe's unfolding, it may be something closer to rhythm, a natural progression of increasing complexity that was bound to happen sooner or later. Maybe that's why so many ancient cultures saw no difference between the natural and the divine. The Greeks called it physis, a living order. The Chinese spoke of the Tao, the way of things. Indigenous traditions around the world understood the land and sea as intelligent, responsive, alive. These worldviews didn't oppose science. They predated it, expressing in poetry what we now explore in physics. The Cambrian Explosion, seen through that lens, wasn't a supernatural event. It was the universe doing what it has always done, creating patterns that know themselves. We are often uncomfortable with the idea that nature could be purposeful without a designer. We want either blind chance or divine control, not something in between. But the in-between is exactly where the Cambrian seems to dwell. It was a dance of chemistry and necessity, guided by laws that seem impartial yet produce astonishing harmony. The word natural should perhaps include that mystery, the tendency of the cosmos to self-organize toward awareness. If that's true, then everything that happened in the Cambrian was as inevitable as sunrise, even if it appeared sudden to the eyes of time. Think of how life moves, toward perception. First came molecules that could copy themselves. Then, over vast spans of time, Those molecules learn to coordinate, to form cells, to sense, to move. Eventually, they learn to see and think. None of this required an external push. It arose from the properties of matter itself. When atoms follow their rules long enough, awareness blooms. That is the great quiet miracle of nature. It doesn't need to be told what to do. It knows. Perhaps that's the secret hidden in the word natural. It doesn't mean accidental. It means belonging to a pattern so vast and consistent that we can't see its edges. The Cambrian Explosion was one more pulse in that pattern, a heartbeat in the long life of the Earth. The same energy that ignited those early oceans still hums through everything alive today. It's in the branching of trees, the movement of tides, the spark of thought. When we look at nature as a whole, the distinction between intention and spontaneity begins to fade. Everything flows. Everything arises from the same deep current. It's comforting, in a way, to think that life did not need to be planned to be meaningful. Purpose might not require an author. It might simply emerge whenever conditions allow beauty to form. The Cambrian world, with all its strangeness and invention, was an expression of that truth. It didn't need a reason to exist beyond its own unfolding. It happened because the universe is the kind of place where life happens, and that, in itself, is reason enough. When we call something natural, perhaps what we really mean is that it is older than our understanding, beyond the reach of human design, but not beyond the reach of meaning. The Cambrian seas, with their luminous creatures and strange architectures, were natural in that way, wild, spontaneous, self-created. But they were also sacred, because they revealed the depth of what nature can do on its own. To be natural is not to be random, it is to belong to, the rhythm that connects all things. So maybe the Cambrian Explosion wasn't a fluke or a miracle. Maybe it was the universe doing what it always does, finding new ways to know itself. The line between natural and intentional disappears when we realize they might be the same thing seen from different sides. What we call accident could be the expression of a pattern too vast for us to predict, and what we call design could be the inevitable beauty of order emerging from chaos. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the whisper that moves through all of nature, from the first molecules to the last heartbeat. It says, there is no separation. The laws that govern stars are the same that build wings, shells, and eyes, the same that create thought. The Cambrian Explosion was one verse in that endless song, a moment when the universe remembered its own capacity for wonder. Natural, yes, but never accidental. 10. The great silence before the song. Long before the Cambrian seas shimmered with eyes and motion, there was an earth wrapped in silence, a still world, patient and slow, waiting for something unnamed. That silence wasn't the absence of life. It was life in its earliest, quietest form, invisible, microscopic, existing beneath notice. For billions of years, the planet's surface changed only in texture and light. The continents drifted, the air thickened, volcanoes whispered smoke into the skies. Beneath all that, in the shallow waters and the dark depths, life endured without spectacle. It multiplied, divided, and adapted, moving through ages like a steady heartbeat too faint to hear. This was the long prelude to the song, the silence before the Cambrian sudden music. It's difficult for us, who live in a world alive with sound and colour, to imagine the depth of that stillness. There were no rustling leaves or birds calling through the air. The land was barren rock, windswept and rough, marked only by minerals and erosion. The seas were dim and calm, lit by sunlight that filtered through haze. And within those waters, the simplest organisms floated in endless repetition, cells feeding, dividing, drifting. No creature chased another. No eyes saw. No fins sliced through the current. Time itself seemed unhurried, as if the planet were content to sleep. But silence, in nature, is rarely static. It's often the sound of preparation. Beneath that stillness, complexity was gathering momentum. The oxygen levels were rising. The chemistry of the oceans was changing. Microscopic organisms were trading genes, forming colonies, experimenting with cooperation. If you could have looked closely, far closer than the eye can see, you would have witnessed quiet revolutions. Cells began to specialize. Some learned to stick together, forming simple multicellular bodies. Others started to coordinate movement, responding to light or touch. In these small, unseen gestures, life was learning the grammar that would one day compose the poetry of the Cambrian Explosion. There's a certain grace in that idea, that the most transformative moments often begin in stillness. We are used to associating progress with motion, with noise, with activity, but the Earth reminds us that creation often begins in the quiet. The great silence before the Cambrian wasn't empty, it was a gathering of potential. Every atom, every molecule, every genetic experiment was contributing to an unseen crescendo. When the music of life finally began, it was because the silence had prepared the stage perfectly. Perhaps that's a pattern written into the universe itself. Before the stars formed, there was the darkness of the cosmic void. Before the first heartbeat, there is the pause of breath. Creation seems to thrive on stillness, on waiting. The pre-Cambrian Earth, with its endless calm, might have been the cosmos holding its breath before exhaling into life's grand design. The quiet was necessary, not as absence, but as readiness. The oceans of that era were like vast laboratories, but without witnesses. The sediments accumulated layer by layer, recording slow chemical dances. Microbial mats spread across shallow seafloors, catching sunlight and producing oxygen. This gradual oxygenation changed everything, though it happened over eons. Life could now breathe in a way it never had before. But even then, the transformation was slow, so slow that it must have felt eternal. From the vantage point of a single day, nothing would have seemed to change. And yet, across the span of millions of years, that silence began to hum faintly, like the low note that precedes a symphony. When we study those ancient rocks, we find traces of this prelude, tiny fossils of soft-bodied organisms, the first experiments in form. They look simple to us, discs, fronds, ribbons of tissue, but they were extraordinary in their time. They represent life's earliest attempts at architecture. In them, we can see the beginnings of symmetry, the faint blueprint of organization that would later define every animal. Some were flat, anchored to the sea floor. Others floated freely, filtering nutrients from the water. None had bones or shells or eyes. They existed in a world that had not yet learned to see itself. And yet, something about their shapes suggests curiosity, a tentative reaching. They seem to be feeling their way forward through time, exploring what it means to exist. Perhaps the Earth itself was doing the same, learning through these forms how to become alive in complexity. Each simple organism was a question, and the Cambrian Explosion would be the answer. In the silence of that era, extinction was constant but quiet. Species emerged and vanished with little trace. There were no predators to drive change, only the slow, indifferent forces of environment and chemistry. But even extinction served a purpose. Each failure taught the planet something new about resilience. Each collapse cleared space for the next. Experiment. The Earth was not asleep, it was rehearsing. The great bloom of life that would come later depended on this long apprenticeship in stillness. Sometimes I wonder what it would have felt like to exist in that age not as a human observer, but as part of that early web of life. Would there have been any sense of anticipation? Would those ancient cells have felt the coming shift? The gathering potential? Probably not, and yet the thought lingers. Maybe the universe knows when it's about to create something new. Maybe the same way we can feel a storm before it breaks, or silence before it turns into sound. The Earth itself felt that tension, that readiness for transformation. When the Cambrian Explosion finally came, it was as though the silence broke open. The world erupted in light and motion. New forms appeared so quickly that even the rocks struggled to record them all. But that suddenness was built on the foundation of stillness. Every muscle, every eye, every pattern of movement was born from that long preparation. Without the silence, the song could never have existed. Perhaps there's a lesson in that one that extends beyond prehistory. We too live in moments of quiet before change. Our own evolution, personal or collective, often follows the same rhythm. Stillness, then motion. Patience, then revelation. The Cambrian Earth shows us that silence is not the opposite of creation, it is creation's first breath. The universe seems to move this way in all things. It waits, it gathers, it prepares, and then it blooms. There's an elegance to that rhythm, an ancient reassurance. The same laws that shape the Earth's oceans shape our lives. We are part of that same cosmic habit of transformation. When we encounter silence, when the world seems still, When progress feels invisible, it may be that something vast is preparing to emerge. The quiet does not mean nothing is happening. It means the world is listening to itself. If you close your eyes now, you might imagine that ancient world again, the gentle sway of water, the faint glimmer of sunlight through shallow seas, the slow pulse of unseen life. It is peaceful, but also charged, like the air before thunder. You can almost sense it, the potential in every drop, every grain of sediment. The world is not asleep. It is waiting to sing, and when the first voices of the Cambrian finally rose, the flick of a fin, the beat of a heart, the gleam of an eye, they carried with them the memory of that silence. The song of life was not a rejection of stillness, but its expression. Even now, beneath all the motion and noise of existence, that great silence remains. It is the background hum of being, the quiet foundation beneath every heartbeat, every thought, every breath. It is where creation begins and where it will begin again. 11. The light of vision. There must have been a moment, somewhere in those Cambrian seas, when the world became visible for the very first time. Imagine it after billions of years of life, moving through darkness and instinct. There comes a spark of awareness, a flicker of perception. Light, once only a warmth or a rhythm, becomes something to see. The oceans that had always been a blur of motion and shadow suddenly revealed form and distance. For the first time, life could look upon life. It's difficult to grasp the magnitude of that shift. The evolution of vision was not just a biological innovation, it was a philosophical one. The universe, through the eyes of its creatures, learned to observe itself. Before vision, the world was a place of nearness. Everything that existed lived by touch, by chemical exchange, by the simple feedback of contact. A cell might sense the warmth of sunlight or the texture of another cell, but it had no concept of far away. Its world was limited to what it could physically reach. Then, in an astonishing twist of chemistry and time, light-sensitive cells began to cluster together. A few molecules that once simply absorbed sunlight for energy began to serve another function. They detected brightness, direction, and eventually, shape. These clusters became primitive eyes, and with them came the concept of space. For the first time, distance existed as something that could be known. The first creatures to see were not seeing the way we do. Their vision was crude, more like an awareness of light and shadow than an image. Yet even that simple distinction, light versus dark, was revolutionary. It allowed the earliest eyes to sense movement, to recognize change. And in a world where movement could mean life or death, that difference was everything. The predator could now detect prey, the prey could now detect the predator. In that instant, evolution itself accelerated. Vision was a new kind of communication between beings, a silent dialogue of motion and response. The seas became a stage of watching and being watched. Consider the trilobite, one of the Cambrian's most iconic creatures. Its eyes were complex compound lenses made of crystal, each facet capturing a fragment of light, all combined into a mosaic of perception. Those eyes were not soft or fragile, but mineral, part of the creature's exoskeleton, fossilizing perfectly in stone. When we look into those ancient lenses now, frozen for 500 million years, we are looking into the oldest preserved eyes in the world. Through them, we glimpse the dawn of sight. The trilobite's vision was a miracle of engineering, yet it arose naturally, step by step, from the chemistry of light and pigment. The universe didn't need to invent sight from nothing. It only had to discover that light could reveal. The emergence of vision changed everything, not just for individual species, but for the planet's entire ecosystem. Light, once a passive background to life, became an active force. Creatures began to display colors, to camouflage, to communicate visually. The rhythms of day and night gained new meaning. The surface world, illuminated by the sun, grew crowded and competitive, while the deep sea became a realm of shadows and glows. Eyes led to brains, and brains led to behavior. With every new form of sight came a new way of thinking. Seeing required interpretation. A creature that could see also had to decide what to do with what it saw. In this way, vision gave birth to choice. It's humbling to realize that the simple act of seeing carries within it a cosmic lineage. The light that enters your eyes now is the same light that illuminated those ancient oceans. Every photon carries the memory of that first dawn of awareness. When we look around us, we are participating in a process that began 500 million years ago, a lineage of perception stretching back to the first glimmers of sight. Each pair of eyes, from insect to mammal to human, is an heir to that ancient inheritance. Sometimes, when we talk about evolution, we describe it as a process without direction, without purpose. But there's something about vision that makes that view difficult to hold. Vision feels purposeful, even poetic. The fact that molecules capable of detecting light evolved into structures capable of understanding light, capable of beauty, even seems to whisper of deeper intention. Light, by its nature, reveals. Perhaps it was always inevitable that life would one day learn to use it, to see itself reflected in it. Maybe the universe, in its long journey toward consciousness, needed eyes as much as eyes needed light. If you could float among those early creatures, you might witness a world coming into focus in real time. Imagine the scene. Shallow water dappled with sunlight, trilobites crawling across rippled sand, jelly-like organisms pulsing in the current. As light filters through the waves, it catches on shells and bodies, casting faint shadows. Some creatures pause as another passes, a flicker, a silhouette, a recognition. These are the first glances exchanged in the history of life, the earliest moments when being was mirrored in perception. Before this, existence was a closed loop, a cell reacting to its environment. Now it was an open dialogue. The world had begun to look back. Vision also introduced something profoundly emotional into the story of life. To see is to be aware of difference of self and other, of near and far. The Cambrian seas must have felt suddenly alive with new sensations. Curiosity, alertness, even something like fear. Awareness comes with vulnerability. A creature that can see danger must also feel it. In a sense, the first eyes brought not just perception but emotion, the beginnings of consciousness as we understand it. From those simple eyes, the long arc of awareness would rise, culminating in beings like us who can not only see but know that they are seeing. The beauty of this transformation is how seamlessly it fits within nature's flow. No one forced life to develop vision. It arose because light was there, waiting to be recognized. The potential for sight existed in the physics of the universe long before any living thing appeared. When those first cells evolved pigments sensitive to light, they were merely uncovering a property that had always been present. Vision was not an accident, it was a realization. The cosmos had always contained the capacity for seeing. It only needed eyes to make it manifest. Sometimes, when you watch sunlight filtering through water or through leaves, it's possible to feel that continuity, that ancient conversation between light and life. The same light that once struck trilobite shells now strikes your own eyes. The same wavelengths that guided the first predators and prey now paint your world with color. The story of vision is not just evolutionary, it's personal. It's in every glance we share, every recognition, every moment of wonder when we see something beautiful and feel for an instant connected to everything. If we could compress time, speeding, up billions of years into a few moments, we might see light spreading through life like a slow dawn. Each new eye would be a spark, each glimmer of awareness another step toward consciousness. The Cambrian Explosion was the sunrise of that dawn, the moment when the light of the sun and the light of perception finally met. From that meeting, everything that followed, art, memory, imagination, was born. And yet, even now, the process continues. Evolution has not stopped inventing ways to see. Eyes have appeared independently many times across the tree of life, each time in new forms and functions. Some perceive heat, some see ultraviolet, some detect polarization. The universe seems endlessly fascinated with the act of looking. It keeps finding new ways to reveal itself to itself. When you close your eyes tonight, think of those ancient oceans. Think of the first creatures who opened theirs and saw light breaking through the water. For them, that light must have been both revelation and mystery, a new dimension of existence. For us, it remains the same. Every sunrise, every glint of starlight, every reflection in glass is a continuation of that first moment. The light of vision never faded, it only deepened, branching from water to air, from instinct to awareness, from perception to meaning. The eyes of the world opened once in the Cambrian, and they have never truly closed since. Each of us carries that awakening within, the memory of light meeting life, the echo of that first sight that turned a silent ocean into a living world. The act of seeing is our oldest inheritance, a thread unbroken across 500 million years, still shimmering, still asking the same quiet question: what will we see next? 12. Blueprints of being. When we look at the diversity of life today, the wings of a dragonfly, the petals of a flower, the structure of the human hand, it's easy to forget that all these designs, however different, trace back to a single moment in deep time. During the Cambrian period, life began to experiment with architecture. Not the architecture of cities or temples, but of bodies, frameworks built from cells, guided by invisible instructions. It was in those ancient seas that the first blueprints of being were drawn, lines written not in ink or stone, but in the silent code of DNA. These blueprints have endured, copied and adapted for over 500 million years. They are still with us, written into the fibres of every living thing. To understand what changed during the Cambrian, imagine the Earth before it, the Ediacaran world of soft shapes, gentle and strange. Life then was fluid, formless, a collection of beings without bones or shells drifting like ideas uncommitted to paper. Then, seemingly all at once, nature began to build with precision. The world that followed was filled with patterns that feel familiar. Even now, symmetry, segmentation, limbs, eyes, spines. It was as though life had discovered geometry. The designs that emerged were not random. They were organized around invisible principles, recurring like motifs in a vast cosmic composition. The Cambrian Explosion, for all its chaos and experimentation, was the moment order began to take physical form. In modern biology, scientists sometimes refer to the body plan, the basic layout of an organism's anatomy. What's extraordinary is that nearly all of the major body plans that exist today appeared during the Cambrian. From the elegant simplicity of jellyfish to the segmented bodies of arthropods, from the soft forms of worms to the first primitive vertebrates, each design appeared, found its niche, and has persisted ever since. Evolution has diversified and refined them, but it has rarely created new ones. The blueprints drawn in those ancient waters became the foundation for everything that followed. The Cambrian was not merely an age of discovery, it was the moment of decision, when the possibilities of life were drafted and sealed into the fabric of evolution. To look at a modern creature, any creature, is to glimpse those ancient designs still at work. The symmetry of a fish mirrors that of its distant ancestors. The arrangement of a human spine echoes the first chordates that swam in Cambrian tides. Even the patterns that shape our faces and limbs follow rules first written by those earliest architects. The Hox genes, those quiet molecular designers, were the tools that made it possible. They do not build bodies directly but tell other genes where and when to act. They are the composers of life's symphony, setting the rhythm and sequence that turn simple cells into form. During the Cambrian, these genes were like new instruments added to an orchestra, expanding the range of what life could play. It's astonishing to think how much complexity can arise from such simple beginnings. A few regulatory genes, a handful of chemical signals, and suddenly the world bursts with creatures that can move, hunt, and perceive. The blueprints of being are not static diagrams. They are dynamic processes, unfolding in time like music. Each embryo, whether trilobite or human, performs the same ancient sequence, replaying the choreography of creation that was perfected in those early seas. In a sense, every birth is a remembrance, a living echo of the Cambrian moment, when structure and possibility first intertwined. And yet, even within that apparent structure, there is room for endless variation. The blueprints were never meant to be rigid. They were flexible, adaptable, allowing for the improvisation that defines evolution. The same plan that gives rise to the fins of a fish can, with a few changes, form the wings of a bird or the hands of a primate. The same pattern that builds the spine of a worm can be reshaped into the backbone of a whale. Nature works not as an engineer, but as an artist, revising, remixing, reimagining. The diversity of life is not an accident of chance, but the result of a design that was built to evolve. In that sense, the Cambrian Explosion was not just an event, it was the beginning of a language. Life learned to speak in structure, to express itself through form. Each new creature was a sentence in that unfolding language, each adaptation a new phrase. Over time, those sentences became paragraphs, stories, entire epics of survival and transformation. The Earth became a library of living forms, each one related to the next by the grammar of evolution. Even extinction, when it came, did not erase the story, it simply made room for new chapters. The patterns endured, passed on through DNA, refined by time. If you were to hold a fossil from that era, a trilobite, a shelled worm, a creature like Anomalocaris, you would be holding a blueprint in stone. Each ridge and curve is the trace of an idea, an attempt by life to solve the puzzle of existence. And if you could peer even closer, beyond the fossil and into the code that once animated it, you would find a familiar rhythm, the same genetic motifs that hum within you. We are built from the same instructions that once shaped those ancient creatures. The materials have changed, the outcomes refined, but the core patterns remain. Life, it seems, does not discard its lessons. It builds upon them, folding old solutions into new designs. Sometimes I wonder if the universe itself follows a similar principle. Perhaps creation is always building upon what came before, refining rather than reinventing. The laws of physics did not change when life began. They were simply expressed in a new way. The emergence of body plans might be the biological equivalent of that, an echo of a deeper law, one that favors organization, symmetry, and continuity. If that's true, then the Cambrian Explosion wasn't a random outburst of creativity. It was a revelation of how the universe itself tends to move from simplicity toward pattern, from chaos toward coherence, from possibility toward being. The blueprints of life also carry within them a kind of memory. When we dream, when we create, when we imagine new forms and structures, perhaps we are tapping into that same ancient instinct to design, to give shape to what was once formless. The patterns that emerged in the Cambrian never truly left us. They live in the symmetry of our faces, in the rhythm of our heartbeat, in the spiral of our DNA. We are not separate from those early architects. We are their continuation, their experiment carried forward through time. If you close your eyes for a moment and picture those ancient seas, you can almost see the first architects at work, not with tools or intent, but with the quiet patience of evolution. Creatures drift and crawl, some failing, some succeeding, each iteration refining the last. The ocean itself seems to hum with invention, every wave carrying a new design, a new variation. Slowly, the world grows more intricate, more aware of its own possibilities. It's a process both random and deliberate, chaotic and harmonious. It's the universe designing itself, through the medium of life. And so the blueprints of being endure not as relics of the past, but as living principles that continue to shape the present. Every organism, every heartbeat, every act of creation is a continuation of that first great design. The Cambrian was not the beginning of life, but the moment life began to know itself through form. It was when the formless became structured, when potential took shape, when the universe, through the language of biology, began to draw its own reflection. The blueprints written then still guide us now. They are the invisible geometry beneath all things, living the rhythm that connects us to the first eyes that opened in water, to the first spines that flexed in movement, to the first hearts that pulsed with the rhythm of survival. And perhaps they guide us still, not only in our bodies but in our dreams, urging us to build, to imagine, to give shape to the invisible. For we too are architects of being, carrying within us the memory of a world that once learned how to design itself into existence. 13. The breath of motion. There is a moment in every story of creation when stillness gives way to movement. In the history of life on Earth, that moment arrived during the Cambrian period. For billions of years, existence had unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, cells dividing, colonies forming, organisms drifting with the tides. Then, in what seems like an instant of geological time, motion became the language of survival. Creatures learned not just to drift or grow, but to move with intention. Muscles formed, limbs flexed, bodies swam and crawled. The world that had been quiet and slow began to shimmer with motion, and in that motion, a new kind of life emerged. Life that acted, that explored, that began to know the world through movement. The oceans of the Cambrian must have been a site of mesmerizing energy. The sediments that once lay undisturbed were now patterned with trails, grooves, and burrows, the signatures of creatures moving through the soft seafloor. The still film of microbial mats that had covered the planet's shallows for eons was being stirred, overturned, and rewritten. Every ripple of water carried the vibrations of life in motion. Predators gliding, prey fleeing, scavengers tunneling, explorers searching. The sea had become a living tapestry of kinetic design, a choreography of survival and curiosity. Movement changed everything. It allowed life to interact with the world in ways that had never been possible. A creature that could move could choose where to go toward food, away from danger, toward the light, or into the shelter of the dark. In motion, life gained freedom, but also responsibility. For the first time, existence required awareness. To move was to decide, to sense, to predict. A stationary world gave way to one that was dynamic and reactive, full of anticipation. The planet itself seemed to awaken, its silence replaced by the pulse of motion. The invention of muscles, the biological machinery that made motion possible, was among life's most elegant solutions. A simple arrangement of contractile fibers allowed a creature to bend, twist, and propel itself through water. Over time, those fibers became more specialized, layered into complex systems of movement. The first flutters of muscle were faint, barely perceptible, but they carried with them the seeds of everything that would come later: swimming, crawling, walking, running, flying. The entire future of motion was contained in those first trembling contractions, those subtle pulses of energy that turned stillness into journey. In many ways, movement was also the birth of awareness. A creature that moves must sense where it is and where it's going. It must recognize obstacles, anticipate danger, and remember paths. The nervous system, in its earliest form, evolved in response to this need. Motion and sensation became intertwined, each refining the other. The more a creature moved, the more it needed to perceive, and the more it perceived, the more sophisticated its motion became. It was an upward spiral of intelligence born from simple necessity. Through movement, life discovered not only space but time, because to move is to change position, to feel the passing of moments. Imagine a small Cambrian animal, perhaps an early worm-like creature, wriggling across the seafloor. It feels the texture of the sediment beneath it, the tug of currents above, the faint vibrations of distant motion. Every sense is engaged in the act of movement. Each contraction of its body is a statement of existence. I am here. I am going there. That awareness, faint as it was, contained the essence of what would one day become thought. Motion is not only physical, it is the first gesture of consciousness, the first recognition of cause and effect. As life became mobile, the world itself began to transform in response. The ocean floor, once smooth and quiet, became sculpted by living trails. Layers of sediment show the marks of creatures exploring, burrowing, testing the terrain. These traces, preserved in stone, are some of the earliest evidence of behavior, fossilized expressions of curiosity and choice. It's humbling to think that long before minds existed to imagine, bodies had already begun to express intention. The act of moving was, in itself, the first act of imagination, to leave one place for another without knowing what would be found there. The emergence of motion also introduced a new dimension to evolution interaction. Predators began to chase prey, and prey began to escape. This dynamic created a constant dialogue of adaptation, each side shaping the other in a feedback loop of innovation. Speed begot speed, defense begot cunning. Nature began to design not just for survival but for performance. The grace of a swimmer, the efficiency of a crawler, the rhythm of a filter feeder, all were sculpted by the demands of motion. Evolution became not just a process of change but a dance. There is something profoundly poetic about that dance. Every living thing, from the smallest plankton to the largest whale, participates in the choreography that began in those ancient seas. The flow of movement, the pulse of energy through muscle and nerve, is one of the most unifying rhythms in the story of life. Even in stillness, movement continues at smaller scales, blood flowing, cells dividing, electrons spinning. The universe itself seems to move with the same endless momentum, as if motion is its most fundamental truth. Sometimes I think about how movement has shaped not only the body, but the mind. Every journey begins with curiosity, with a willingness to move beyond what is known. Perhaps that instinct comes from the very first creatures that dared to move across the Cambrian seabed, guided by nothing but sensation and chance. In them, the seed of exploration was planted. a seed that would one day lead to wings that crossed skies, legs that climbed mountains, and minds that wandered beyond Earth. The story of motion is the story of discovery, written first in the language of biology and later in the language of thought. The Cambrian Explosion may have been filled with dazzling new forms, but what truly made it extraordinary was not shape, but motion. The sudden realization that life could go. The difference between drifting and moving is the difference between existing and experiencing. Motion introduced choice, and choice gave rise to individuality. Each creature became its own navigator, its own experiment in direction. The ocean, once a passive cradle, became a world of explorers, every organism a vessel on an uncharted voyage. And even now, that voyage continues. Every step we take, every heartbeat that propels blood through our veins, every neuron that fires to guide a hand or a thought, is part of the same lineage. The breath of motion that stirred the Cambrian seas still moves through us. It is the pulse of life itself, the rhythm that connects every creature that has ever lived. When we walk, we echo the first crawling things. When we swim, we return to the ancestral sea. When we move with purpose, we carry forward that ancient inheritance of curiosity and will. Sometimes, in moments of deep stillness, when we sit perfectly quiet, we can feel it, the faint vibration beneath the calm. The body never stops moving entirely. The heart beats, the lungs rise and fall, the cells within us churn with energy. Stillness, in truth, is only the surface. Beneath it, motion continues. The Cambrian world discovered that truth first. The silence of its early oceans was broken not by noise, but by movement, by the quiet stirring of life into action. If you imagine standing on the shore of that world, watching the sunlight scatter through the shallow water, you might see it happen. A faint ripple, a flicker of motion in the sand, then another, and another, until the whole sea seems alive. That was the moment the planet began to breathe in rhythm with its creatures, when life learned to dance with the world around it. Every motion since, from the flutter of a leaf to the orbit of a planet, is part of that same vast choreography. The breath of motion began in the Cambrian, but it never ended. It became the pulse of the planet, the heartbeat of evolution, the quiet engine that drives all creation. We are its latest expression, still learning how to move through our own vast oceans of possibility. Every step, every choice, every act of reaching forward is a continuation of that ancient journey, the moment when life first learned that to live is to move. 14. The language of survival. When the Cambrian seas awakened with motion, life's story became not only about form and movement, but also about communication. Every flick of a fin, every shimmer of colour, every ripple through the water became part of an emerging language, one not spoken in words but in instinct, reaction, and rhythm. It was the language of survival, and in its earliest expressions it was both beautiful and brutal. The world had become aware of itself in a new way, and awareness always brings with it the need to respond. Before this era, survival had been simple. Life was mostly static, feeding and dividing, guided by chemical signals too subtle for perception. But as soon as creatures began to move and see, a new complexity unfolded. Now there was competition. Now there was choice. The oceans filled with interaction, predator and prey, hunter and hunted, each influencing the other in a silent conversation, written in movement and colour. In that dynamic, the planet invented communication long before sound or speech, a living grammar of adaptation. Imagine those waters, alive with signals. The shimmer of a translucent body could mean danger or invitation. The pulse of bioluminescence might call a mate or distract a predator. A sudden dart through the current might say, "I am fast, you cannot catch me," while the curling of spines might whisper, "Try, and you'll regret it." The ocean floor became a stage where every creature performed its part in this unending play of signal and response. And though the actors changed over millions of years, the rules remained the same. Every action carried meaning. What's astonishing is that this language, once limited to instinct, would become the foundation for everything we now call intelligence. It began with sensation, the ability to detect, to react, to adapt. But slowly, through the quiet persistence of evolution, that ability became strategy. Some creatures began to deceive, blending into sand or pretending to be inedible. Others began to cooperate, forming colonies or pairs that moved as one. Even without thought, life was learning the art of relationship. It was beginning to say, in its own primal way, "I exist because you do. I change because you change." The language of survival is not only about aggression or defense, it's about balance. Every predator that evolved gave rise to prey that matched its cunning. Every adaptation inspired another in response. The Cambrian Explosion was not chaos, as it sometimes seems, but a conversation conducted at the scale of biology. For every tooth that formed, an armor followed. For every faster swimmer, a better hider emerged. This delicate exchange created the first ecosystems, intricate webs of interdependence that would echo throughout time. When we study fossils from that era, we can still trace fragments of that conversation. The shells of trilobites bear scars, marks of encounters survived, battles endured. The strange, spiny creatures that once floated in those waters show patterns of growth designed to deter predators. The record of stone is full of messages like these, frozen echoes of life's dialogue with itself. Each fossil is both a remnant of form and a remnant of strategy, proof that existence was never static but reactive, alive in a perpetual exchange of adaptation. Over millions of years, that same dialogue deepened into complexity. As senses sharpened, responses became faster and more refined. The first nervous systems evolved into intricate networks of connection, capable of processing not just stimuli but memory. Creatures began to remember danger, to anticipate patterns, to learn. In doing so, they crossed an invisible threshold. They became not just participants in nature, but interpreters of it. The language of survival had evolved into something more subtle: awareness. It's strange to think that the roots of all human thought, of every poem, every equation, every act of empathy, lie in that ancient grammar of survival. When early organisms responded to light or movement, they were performing the first act of recognition, the earliest version of understanding. That awareness grew, shaped by necessity, until it became reflection. Even now, our most complex behaviors trace back to those same instincts. The human brain is still fluent in that primal language: fear, attraction, curiosity, cooperation. We are the inheritors of the ocean's first conversations. But if survival began as conflict, it also carried within it the seed of harmony. For competition alone could not sustain life. The predators depended on prey, the reefs depended on algae. Every living thing required others to exist. In the midst of struggle, balance emerged, a kind of unspoken agreement between all forms of life. The planet, through its vast diversity, learned how to sustain itself through equilibrium. Death became a form of renewal, predation a kind of recycling. The Cambrian seas were not only arenas of conflict, but also systems of profound cooperation. Perhaps that's the deeper secret of the language of survival. It is not a language of dominance, but of connection. Every adaptation is a response to another, a gesture that binds rather than separates. The trilobite's shell was shaped by the claws of its hunter, just as the hunter's claws were shaped by the defenses of its prey. Each existence gives meaning to the next. The system thrives not despite struggle, but because of it. Out of the friction of survival came the harmony of life. If you look closely at modern ecosystems, the coral reefs, the forests, the tundras, you can still see that conversation continuing. It speaks in the flight of birds, the migration of fish, the bloom of flowers timed perfectly to the arrival of pollinators. Every movement, every cycle, every adaptation is a word in that unending dialogue. The grammar is balance, the vocabulary is diversity, and though we rarely think of it this way, we are still speaking the same language. Our breath depends on the oxygen made by unseen plankton. Our food comes from the same rhythms of growth and decay that began in the Cambrian tides. We are not outside this conversation, we are woven into it. Perhaps this is why silence in nature feels so powerful. When the world is still, when wind stops, when water lies calm, we can almost hear the echo of that ancient language. It is older than words, older than thought, a conversation spoken by atoms and cells long before we arrive to give it names. It is the hum beneath existence, the rhythm that guides everything that lives. The Cambrian Explosion was not only an event of biological innovation, it was the awakening of dialogue. Life learned not only how to exist, but how to respond to communicate through form, colour and motion. It learned the first truths of relationship, that to survive is to adapt, and to adapt is to listen. And from that listening grew everything: the balance of ecosystems, the awareness of creatures, the self-reflective mind of humanity. When we think of language, we think of words and meaning, but perhaps language, in its truest form, is simply connection. Every interaction between living things, every predator's pursuit, every organism's defense, every breath exchanged through the web of life is a form of speaking. It's the universe conversing with itself through living matter. The Cambrian was when that conversation began to flow openly, when silence turned into dialogue. And so, the language of survival endures. We speak it still, whether we realize it or not. It's in the pulse of the planet, the patterns of migration, the chemistry of every breath. To live is to speak, to exchange energy, awareness, and meaning with the world around us. The first creatures of the Cambrian may have had no words, but their movements, their struggles, their symmetries were the first sentences in the story of life's great conversation. We are simply the continuation of that story, still learning, still listening, still answering the same question whispered through the water so long ago. How will you survive, and what will you become as you do? 15. The architects of change. When we think of evolution, we often imagine a process that happens on its own, quiet, automatic, indifferent. Yet in the Cambrian seas, something remarkable occurred. Life began to act as its own architect. For the first time, organisms didn't just adapt to the world, they began to transform it. The seabeds, the currents, the chemistry of the oceans all started to change under the influence of the beings that lived within them. The planet was no longer shaping life alone. Life was now shaping the planet in return. Before this era, the Earth had been a passive canvas. It provided the materials, minerals, light and water, and life painted itself upon it in simple strokes. But during the Cambrian, that relationship reversed. The new creatures, armed with motion and appetite, began to alter the very systems that sustained them. Burrowing animals churned the sediments, releasing oxygen into deeper layers of the sea. Shell-building species drew minerals from the water, subtly, changing its chemistry. Predators and prey reshaped the balance of ecosystems, creating feedback loops that rippled through the environment. The ocean that had once been still and uniform became structured, alive with gradients of energy and activity. This was the dawn of the ecological engineer, the first time life took part in constructing its own world. The term ecosystem didn't exist then, of course, but the principle was already at work. Each creature's existence affected the others, not by intention, but by participation. The trilobite that stirred sediment changed the chemistry of the water. The plankton that photosynthesized altered the balance of gases in the atmosphere. Life had become a planetary force, and the Cambrian Explosion was its first major project. If we could somehow drift through those ancient waters, we would see evidence of this transformation everywhere. The seafloor, once smooth and uniform, was carved with patterns, burrows, tunnels, feeding traces. The light that filtered through the surface danced over diverse landscapes, coral-like reefs, microbial mats, patches of sediment that pulsed with hidden movement. These were not random textures. They were the signatures of design, though not in the human sense. They were the architecture of interaction. Every creature, simply by living, was shaping space and structure. There's a quiet poetry in that. The Earth, which had spent billions of years forming mountains, oceans, and atmospheres through slow geologic processes, now had help. Tiny organisms, barely visible to the eye, were becoming collaborators in planetary creation. The line between biology and geology began to blur. The rocks of the Cambrian preserve this collaboration. Fossils of shells and bones, yes, but also the marks of movement, the chemical fingerprints of life-altering stone. The Earth's crust itself became a kind of biological memory, a diary written in calcium, carbon, and clay. The architects of change, they were not aware of their role, of course. They were simply surviving, responding to the world around them. But that's the wonder of evolution. It doesn't require awareness to create complexity. Every act of feeding, every breath, every reproduction becomes part of a collective transformation. Life evolves, but in doing so, it evolves the world itself. The Cambrian period was the moment when that feedback loop became unstoppable. Once life learned to shape its surroundings, there was no turning back. It's fascinating to consider how small changes led to enormous consequences. The invention of burrowing, for instance, seems like a minor adaptation, a way for a creature to hide or feed. Yet it fundamentally changed the chemistry of the oceans, mixing oxygen into sediments that had been stagnant for eons. That, in turn, allowed new kinds of organisms to thrive, accelerating the pace of diversification. Similarly, the creation of shells and exoskeletons, meant for protection, introduced vast amounts of calcium carbonate into the planet's geological record. Those shells would eventually form limestone, altering landscapes for millions of years. What began as survival strategy became geological history. We often speak of the Cambrian Explosion as an explosion of life, but perhaps it was equally an explosion of creativity, an awakening of agency within nature itself. The architects of change were not designers with plans or visions, but participants in a grand improvisation. Each new adaptation was a brushstroke, and together they painted the dynamic world we now inherit. There's something profoundly humbling in that thought. The realization that the stability of our planet, its oxygen, its soils, its cycles, are all products of those ancient acts of unknowing creation. From that time onward, Earth's history became a dialogue between biology and environment. The two would sculpt one another endlessly, glaciers forming and melting, forests rising and falling, species blooming and vanishing. The pattern established in the Cambrian continued through every subsequent age, from the Devonian's forests to the Carboniferous swamps to the coral reefs of today. Life did not merely endure change, it became the engine of it. The architects of the Cambrian had set the precedent. To live was to alter. Perhaps that's why evolution, though driven by chance, feels so purposeful. Each adaptation seems to anticipate the next, as though the world were collaborating with itself through its living parts. The shells that protected early creatures became the source of future rock. The oxygen released by ancient microbes became the breath of future animals. Even extinction, which seems like an ending, is part of the cycle. It clears space for new forms, replenishes the materials for future creation. Nothing in this great architectural process is truly wasted. The design is recursive, self-renewing, endlessly adaptive. If we were to translate that process into human terms, we might call it wisdom, the kind that does not plan but understands, that does not foresee but harmonizes. Nature builds not through blueprints, but through relationship. The architects of change were not builders in the conventional sense. They were connectors, participants in a web of mutual influence. Every creature altered its surroundings just enough to create opportunity for something new. In that way, evolution behaves like art. Its beauty emerges not from precision but from participation. And we too are part of that lineage. Humanity is the latest expression of the Cambrian principle that life is not a passive result of its environment, but an active collaborator in shaping it. Our cities, our technologies, even our thoughts are extensions of that same creative impulse that began in the ocean 500 million years ago. But unlike the early architects, we are aware of our influence. We know that our actions change the world, that our decisions ripple through the biosphere. The question, then, is whether we can learn from our ancestors, the ones who shaped without destroying, who built balance without intention. The architects of the Cambrian remind us that creation and responsibility are the same act. To shape is to care, even if care is expressed through adaptation rather than choice. Life's genius lies in its ability to maintain balance through endless transformation. The trilobites burrow, the corals reef, the leaves fall into soil, all are gestures of reciprocity between being and environment. The challenge of our age is to rediscover that reciprocity, to build with the same awareness that every action alters the greater design. If you picture those ancient oceans again, you might see them as more than habitats. They were laboratories of collaboration, symphonies of cause and effect. Every creature that moved, that fed, that breathed, was contributing to the shaping of the world. And as the eons passed, their creations built upon one another, layer by layer, until the earth itself became a living structure, a cathedral of memory and motion. We are still living inside that cathedral. Its walls are made of the same minerals the Cambrian creatures pulled from the sea. Its air is the inheritance of their chemistry. Its balance is maintained by the same language of survival they spoke. We are not separate from the architects of change. We are their continuation, still building, still shaping, still learning how to live within the masterpiece they began. And if we listen closely to the waves, to the wind, to the quiet hum of the living earth, we might still hear their ancient wisdom whispering through the depths. To exist is to create is to care, and to care is to endure. 16. The first shadows of consciousness. In the still depths of the Cambrian seas, something subtle yet profound began to stir something invisible in the fossils, yet no less real. It wasn't a structure or a shell, not a fin or a spine. It was something more elusive: awareness. The first faint glimmers of what we might one day call consciousness. It's strange to think that in those waters, among trilobites and soft-bodied worms, the first sensations of experience were flickering into being. Tiny electrical impulses coursed through primitive nerve cords. Simple patterns of cause and effect began to shape into something more. Life was beginning, however faintly, to feel. Before this, existence was reactive. Life sensed, but it did not perceive. Cells responded to light and touch, but they did so automatically, without reflection. Then, as nervous systems grew more complex, the responses became layered. One moment of sensation influenced the next. The creature could anticipate, hesitate, choose, and in that hesitation between stimulus and reaction, something new appeared. A space, a pause. Within that pause, the first shadow of consciousness began to take shape. Imagine a small, translucent creature drifting in the warm shallows. It detects light above, the cool pressure of water around, the faint chemical trails of potential food nearby. Its simple brain, no larger than a grain of sand, translates these inputs into movement. It turns, it follows, it flees. Yet in doing so, it begins to create an internal model of its surroundings. The world is no longer just a series of events. It has dimension, continuity, and meaning. That awareness, however rudimentary, is the ancestor of every thought that would ever follow. Consciousness did not arrive as a sudden awakening. It seeped into existence like dawn breaking over a calm sea. It began in the simplest patterns: the coordination of limbs, the memory of safe places, the recognition of light and shadow. Over millions of years, those patterns intertwined, forming networks of interaction that could not only react but recall. Memory, that fragile miracle, allowed experience to echo across moments. The creature could remember danger, recognize safety, and act accordingly. From that, intelligence was born, not the kind we know, full of language and reflection, but a deep, instinctive knowing. Perhaps the most astonishing part of this emergence is how naturally it unfolded. Consciousness was not added to life. It was grown from it, a flowering of complexity that arose wherever energy and awareness converged. The same laws that shape a crystal into symmetry, or a galaxy into spiral arms, were at work here, giving rise to perception from motion and chemistry. The universe, it seems, had been preparing for consciousness all along, waiting for matter to organize itself finely enough to notice its own existence. To feel, in its simplest form, is to be changed by the world. A soft-bodied animal in the Cambrian Sea feels pressure and moves away. It feels warmth and moves toward. That feedback, repeated over and over, becomes the rhythm of awareness. With each repetition, a tiny fragment of experience accumulates. And over time, those fragments weave together into something continuous, a faint stream of consciousness flowing through the dark waters of deep time. If we could step inside that experience, if we could somehow inhabit the mind of one of those early beings, it would not be like human thought. There would be no words, no narrative, no separation between self and environment. It would be pure sensation, the universe knowing itself from within. The first consciousness was not divided. It was immersed, like a current within a greater ocean. There was no I, only awareness itself. Perhaps in that sense, the earliest minds were closer to the fabric of reality than ours are now, unburdened by abstraction, still woven directly into the pulse of the world. And yet, even in that simplicity, something remarkable was happening. With every flicker of awareness, the universe was learning to see itself more clearly. The evolution of perception, of sensation and response, was also the evolution of perspective. The world was no longer silent, it was alive with experience. A jelly-like creature's awareness of light, a trilobite's awareness of movement, these were the universe's first perceptions of itself. The Cambrian Explosion wasn't just a diversification of bodies, it was a diversification of viewpoints. For the first time, the cosmos was being witnessed from countless living eyes, countless centers of sensation. That idea that consciousness might be the universe turning inward is both poetic and strangely plausible. The laws of physics govern energy and matter, but perhaps consciousness is how those laws feel from the inside. If that's true, then the Cambrian period marked a turning point in the story of being itself. Life had not only learned to move and survive, it had learned to experience. The boundaries between matter and mind, between the physical and the perceptual, began to blur. Every organism became a small center of awareness, a point of light in the growing constellation of consciousness that spans the history of life. Of course, those first minds were fragile, fleeting. Awareness was not constant but intermittent, like fireflies in the dark, brief sparks of perception that flickered and vanished. But even a flicker is enough to change everything. Once the possibility of awareness existed, evolution began to build upon it. Nervous systems grew larger, sensory organs more refined. Sight, smell, touch, and sound expanded the range of perception, deepening the world's ability to know itself. The ocean became not only a habitat but a field of experience, shimmering with perception and purpose. It's humbling to think that our own consciousness, our thoughts, emotions, dreams, is built upon that same foundation. The human mind, with all its complexity, is the descendant of those first simple networks of sensation. The feeling of curiosity that drives us, the instinct to seek light or warmth, the urge to explore, they are echoes of that Cambrian inheritance. We are not separate from those early forms of awareness. We are their continuation, their flowering. When we gaze at the stars or close our eyes in wonder, we are performing the same act they began, noticing the world, and by doing so, giving it meaning. Perhaps consciousness is not something that emerged in life, but something life revealed. The potential for awareness may have been present in the universe from the beginning, woven into its equations and energy fields. Life, then, is the mirror that allowed that potential to see itself reflected. The first awareness of the Cambrian seas was like the first reflection of sunlight on water, a sign that the cosmos had found a way to observe its own beauty. What began as a survival tool, a nervous response to light or movement, became something much greater, the capacity to feel wonder. And that capacity, in turn, would shape everything that followed. The awareness that flickered in the Cambrian would grow into empathy, imagination, memory, and longing. It would give rise to the creatures who painted on cave walls, who sang beneath starlight, who pondered their origins. All of it traces back to that first moment when sensation became experience, when the universe realized it could feel itself living. If you listen closely, in moments of deep quiet, you can still sense that ancient awareness pulsing within you. It's the hum of your heartbeat, the rhythm of your breath, the faint continuity that connects thought to thought. It is the same awareness that moved through the first creatures who felt sunlight and shadow, the same thread of perception that has never broken since the Cambrian dawn. We often think of consciousness as something that belongs to us, something we possess, but perhaps it is the other way around. Perhaps we belong to it, to that great unfolding awareness that began long ago, beneath an ancient sun, in an ocean, alive with the first shadows of thought. And, maybe, in that thought, the universe finally found what it had been waiting for. Not perfection, not stability, but recognition. The moment life first became aware was the moment the cosmos learned to look inward. From then on, existence was no longer blind. It had eyes, it had motion, it had awareness. The silence of the universe had found its witness, and through the soft murmur of living minds, it began to speak. 17. When the world found its rhythm. The Cambrian world was not only a time of new forms and new senses, it was the birth of rhythm. Before then, life followed the slow, almost imperceptible pulses of chemistry and tide, a planet breathing through geologic time. But as the first complex creatures moved and perceived, a new kind of order began to emerge, patterns that repeated, synchronized, responded. The world found a tempo. The stillness of the ancient seas gave way to motion not of chaos, but of cadence. Every fin stroke, every flick of a tail, every heartbeat became part of a growing music that filled the oceans with movement and pulse. Rhythm is one of the universe's oldest languages. Long before words or thought, rhythm was how existence organized itself. Stars pulsate, planets orbit, tides rise and fall. Even the simplest atoms vibrate in predictable cycles. It was inevitable, then, that life born of that same cosmic matter would inherit the same pattern. But during the Cambrian, rhythm became something conscious. It was no longer just the background hum of physics. It became the heartbeat of living intention. The trilobites scuttling across the seafloor did not move at random. Its steps formed a steady beat advance. Pause, sense, move again. Each gesture echoed the larger cycles that governed the Earth itself. If we could listen to the Cambrian Ocean, not with our ears but with perception tuned to its patterns, we might hear it as a symphony of pulses, the soft thrum of currents weaving through coral-like reefs, the tapping of limbs against stone, the synchronized waves of creatures rising and falling in schools. Even the smallest plankton moved to an unseen meter, drifting upward by day and sinking by night, following the pull of light and darkness. These cycles were not just responses, they were expressions of harmony between organism and environment. Life had found its rhythm because the world already had one. It simply learned how to dance to it. This discovery was more profound than we often realize. Rhythm was the first bridge between individuality and unity. A creature could move on its own, but to survive, it had to move with the world, with tides, with seasons, with others of its kind. The pulse of the ocean, the turning of the planet, the waxing and waning of light, all became part of an intricate choreography. Through rhythm, life learned cooperation. It learned timing. It learned how to exist within a larger pattern without losing its own. And so, in the slow roll of waves and the quick flutter of fins, a kind of natural synchronization took shape. Predator and prey moved in counterpoint. Currents carried nutrients in recurring flows. Day followed night with unwavering precision. Each repetition reinforced the connection between organism and world. Over millions of years, this synchronization deepened, embedding itself into the very structure of life. The first internal clocks evolved tiny molecular systems attuned to the cycles of sunlight and shadow. Cells began to anticipate rather than simply react. Life was no longer just responding to rhythm, it was keeping time. That may have been one of the most transformative steps in evolution. The creation of memory not only across generations, but across days. The first circadian rhythms, patterns of waking and resting, feeding and retreating were born in the Cambrian seas. In this, we can see the earliest roots of behavior as we understand it. Not just motion, but sequence. Not just reaction, but pattern. Each living thing became a tiny musician in the orchestra of existence, following its own measure, yet always in tune with the larger whole. There's a quiet elegance to this idea that consciousness in its earliest form was rhythmic. Before it was reflective or linguistic, it was patterned, pulsing, aware of cycles. The awareness of time, the difference between before and after, between light and dark, begins with rhythm. Even now, in every heartbeat, every breath, every blink, that ancient awareness continues. We are rhythmic beings by design, our biology composed like music. The beating of our hearts, the rise and fall of our lungs, the cadence of our thoughts all trace their lineage back to the ocean's first measures. Imagine a Cambrian dawn. The light filters through shallow water, scattering across sediment and shell. The creatures that rest on the seafloor begin to stir. Some rise toward the light, others retreat into the cool dark below. This is not random, it's a choreography guided by light's rhythm. The day has begun, and with it, the daily symphony of life. As the sun climbs higher, the water grows warm, and the activity intensifies. Predators emerge to hunt. Swarms of smaller creatures move in waves, each reacting to the next, forming patterns so complex they resemble thought. And when dusk falls, the rhythm shifts again. The ocean quiets, and a different life emerges, nocturnal, glowing, slow. Night has its own pulse, its own tempo. Even the darkness hums. What's astonishing is that these ancient patterns still shape us. The circadian rhythm that governs our sleep, the hormonal cycles that influence our mood, the instinctive synchronization we feel with seasons and tides, all of it began in those Cambrian waters. We carry the memory of that rhythm in our cells. It's why the ocean sound soothes us, why our bodies calm when rocked, why any music moves us so deeply. The pulse we feel in sound and motion is the same pulse that moved through the first living systems. To be alive is to be rhythmic. Perhaps rhythm is life's way of remembering order within chaos. Even in randomness, there are repetitions, echoes, recurrences. In the Cambrian, those repetitions became structure. Patterns of movement evolved into behaviors. Behaviors became instincts. Instincts became awareness. Through rhythm, life began to predict the future, to sense what would come next. That predictive awareness was the foundation for thought. The same neural rhythms that once helped a worm anticipate danger now form the electrical symphony of the human brain. Thought itself is rhythmic, waves of oscillation that pulse through our neurons in constant cycles. The rhythm of the ocean never ended. It moved inward. It's comforting to think that our own inner tempo is part of something far older than us. The heartbeat, steady and unbroken, is a direct descendant of the world's first pulses. The neural oscillations that accompany emotion and memory are echoes of ancient tides. When you listen to your own breath, you're listening to a rhythm that began before language, before life even left the sea. Every living being, in every moment, participates in that same primordial beat. The world found its rhythm long ago, and everything alive still dances to it. Sometimes, when the noise of modern life fades, and you find yourself in stillness in the hush between waves, in the steady breathing of sleep, you can feel it again. The same rhythm that shaped the first living things hums softly through your body. It's there in your pulse, in your breathing, in the quiet repetition of your thoughts. It connects you to everything that ever lived, every creature that ever moved in rhythm with the turning earth. The Cambrian period may seem distant, but its music never stopped. It plays beneath every heartbeat and behind every living sound. The rhythm of life is not a relic. It is the continuity that binds all existence. It is the song of the earth remembering itself through time, each beat a reminder that we are still part of that ancient dance. When the world found its rhythm, it found its unity. And that unity, that pulse, still carries us forward through every breath, every heartbeat, every tide, into the endless rhythm of being. 18. The fragile balance. In every great unfolding of creation, there comes a moment when abundance tests itself. The Cambrian Explosion was a wonder of diversity, of invention, of endless possibility, but it was also a test of balance. With so many new forms, new movements, and new desires filling the seas, the equilibrium that had long defined the planet began to tremble. Predators became more efficient, prey grew more elusive. Ecosystems, once simple and stable, grew intricate and volatile. It was the first time in Earth's history that life itself threatened to outpace its own harmony. The same creativity that gave rise to beauty also brought instability. The Cambrian world was not only a celebration of life, it was the beginning of struggle. In the quiet depths, this tension played out invisibly. Populations boomed and crashed. Food chains wove themselves into complex webs, only to collapse when one link faltered. Species that had thrived for millions of years suddenly vanished, unable to keep up with the accelerating pace of change. Fossil records from this era capture both the grandeur and the fragility of that balance, an orchestra of innovation that, for all its brilliance, was always on the edge of silence. The Earth was learning something new, that creativity must coexist with restraint, that survival required not only invention, but moderation. Imagine standing, if it were possible, on the ancient shoreline of that time. Before you, the sea glimmers with movement, an alien ballet of colour and motion. Trilobites scuttle along the sand in massive herds, their segmented bodies catching light like mirrored armour. Strange predators drift above them, tentacled and graceful, their shadows crossing the seafloor like passing clouds. In this crowded world, every gesture carries consequence. To move is to be seen, to rest is to be caught. Life had become aware not only of opportunity but of risk. Every heartbeat now measured the balance between hunger and survival. The introduction of predation changed the rules of existence forever. Before the Cambrian, life's primary challenge had been endurance, staying alive through the slow rhythms of reproduction and decay. But now, life became dynamic, competitive, reactive. Each organism was forced to adapt not just to the environment, but to the intentions of others. This new web of relationships, predator, prey, scavenger, parasite, demanded constant adjustment. The ocean became a living equation, its balance recalculated with every heartbeat. In this equation, no species stood alone. The success of one became the vulnerability of another. The fragility of that balance was both its danger and its genius. When ecosystems teetered, evolution responded. New strategies arose to stabilize the whole: camouflage, armor, speed, cooperation. Life did not retreat from imbalance, it learned from it. The Cambrian seas became laboratories of adaptation, every crisis an opportunity for innovation. Yet for every adaptation that succeeded, countless others failed. The fossil record speaks as much of disappearance as of emergence. For every species that flourished, dozens perished, their lineages erased before they could even be fully realized. The balance between creation and extinction became the rhythm of life itself. This was the first time the planet witnessed the full cycle of life's own corrections. When diversity expanded too far, ecosystems collapsed, clearing space for renewal. When predators grew too dominant, their prey dwindled, and they too perished, allowing gentler forms to rise again. The Earth was beginning to self-regulate, not through intention but through the quiet intelligence of interdependence. Balance was not a static state, but a constant conversation between excess and restraint. Life, it seemed, could not help but test its boundaries, only to rediscover its need for harmony. There is a deep beauty in that fragility. The very fact that life survived such instability speaks to its resilience, its willingness to bend rather than break. It learned that balance is not achieved by stillness, but by movement, a ceaseless adjustment to the changing tides of circumstance. The Cambrian Ocean, for all its turmoil, found a rhythm within its chaos. It did not seek perfection, it sought continuity. And perhaps that is the truest kind of balance, the kind that allows existence to flow forward through both creation and loss. If we look closely at ourselves, we can see that same pattern still at work. Every cell in our bodies maintains balance through constant motion: ions crossing membranes, signals firing and fading, repair and renewal happening in tandem. Life does not find equilibrium by freezing in place. It finds it by evolving, by listening to the shifts and responding in kind. The fragile balance discovered in the Cambrian did not vanish with time. It became the foundation for every living system since, including our own. Yet fragility carries a warning. For the first time, the Cambrian Earth faced the reality that abundance is not endless. The energy that fueled growth was finite, the spaces that sustained life limited. The more complex the web became, the more vulnerable it was to disruption. One imbalance could ripple outward, collapsing entire ecosystems. It is a truth that still echoes today. Complexity brings both strength and vulnerability. The more connected we are, the more dependent we become on the stability of the whole. There were moments, even in that distant time, when the balance faltered beyond repair. Periods of cooling or oxygen loss swept through the oceans, extinguishing much of the life that had flourished only a few million years earlier. Yet each collapse carried within it the seed of renewal. The survivors, fewer, smaller, humbler, would adapt and repopulate, setting the stage for new eras of diversity. In this cycle, the planet revealed its quiet resilience. Life was not a fragile ornament poised to shatter. It was a process, a current that could bend around obstacles and continue flowing. Fragility, it turned out, was a form of flexibility. The balance of the Cambrian world was not a matter of control, it was a matter of trust. Life trusted the chaos of mutation, the randomness of change, the inevitability of loss. From those uncertainties arose the stability of ecosystems, the continuity of species, and the persistence of existence itself. Perhaps that is why the Cambrian explosion remains so awe-inspiring even now. It was not only a moment of creation, but of self-discovery, a realization that life could sustain itself through impermanence. When we look at the Earth today, with its intricate ecosystems and delicate climates, we are looking at the long echo of that lesson. The same fragile balance that shaped the Cambrian seas shapes us still. Every forest, every coral reef, every human society is a continuation of that experiment. We live within the tension between abundance and restraint, between creation and destruction. The same rules that govern trilobites and worms govern us. When we overreach, the system corrects. When we listen, it restores. Sometimes I wonder if the Earth, in its own quiet way, remembers. Perhaps the wind that sighs through forests and the tides that return without fail are the planet's own form of balance, its way of breathing through change. The Cambrian world taught the Earth to adjust, to flow with its own transformations. That wisdom is written into everything that lives. To survive, we too must remember what those early creatures learned, that balance is not stillness but grace. Picture, for a moment, the end of a Cambrian day. The light fades across the water, casting long shadows over the sea floor. The creatures of that ancient world slow their movements, each returning to its rhythm of rest. For all its chaos, the ocean feels calm again. The balance, fragile though it is, holds for one more night. Tomorrow, the cycle will begin anew. Birth and death, growth and decay, creation and loss, all intertwined in the endless dance of equilibrium. The world, though fragile, endures. It always has. It always will, so long as it remembers how to move with its own tides. 19. The memory of water. Long before the written word, before thought could shape itself into language, the earth kept its memories in water. Every current, every droplet, every tide was a moving archive, carrying the imprints of what had come before. During the Cambrian period, as life bloomed into endless forms, the oceans became not just a cradle of creation but a vessel of remembrance. They held within their depths the record of every breath, every motion, every rise and fall of life. If stone would one day remember through fossils, water remembered through flow, constant, unbroken, alive. To stand by those ancient seas, had it been possible, would have been to feel the weight of history in motion. The water itself had already lived many lives, evaporating into cloud, falling as rain, returning again and again to the deep. Each cycle gathered whispers of what had been. The oceans carried not only salt and mineral, but memory of sunlight absorbed, of creatures that stirred their depths, of worlds that rose and fell within their embrace. Every wave that moved across the Cambrian surface was a continuation of a story that began before life itself. It's difficult for us, who see water as ordinary, to imagine its consciousness. But perhaps consciousness, in its earliest form, was nothing more than reflection, the ability to carry and transform. Water reflects light, sound, and energy. It records movement. Through waves, it reshapes itself endlessly without losing identity. In that way, the oceans may have been the first mirrors in which the universe saw itself. The creatures that evolved within them were not separate from that reflection, they were part of it. Every fin, every ripple, every burst of motion was a continuation of the ocean's memory of flow. The Cambrian explosion intensified this memory beyond measure. Where once the seas had been quiet, now they churned with activity. The movement of countless creatures stirred sediments, mixing oxygen and nutrient, turning the ocean into a living system of exchange. This mixing was not random, it was the ocean thinking, dreaming, remembering through motion. When trilobites burrowed through the silt, they were inscribing patterns into the seafloor that would one day harden into fossils. When predators swam in pursuit, they carved invisible signatures into the water's movement, ripples that spread far beyond their sight. Every act of life was a form of writing. The ocean, as vast as it was, recorded everything, not in language, but in pattern, in the chemistry of its layers, in the temperature of its currents, in the whispers of energy that passed between its depths. If we could read those patterns, perhaps we would see the full story of life written not in stone, but in the fluid geometry of motion. The history of life, after all, is not fixed. It flows, just as the ocean does. Every creature that has ever lived leaves traces in the cycles that continue still, the salt in the sea, the oxygen in the air, the rhythm of tides that mirror the pull of the moon. Water's memory is not precise in the way of human archives. It does not store events, it carries impressions, emotions, continuities. In the Cambrian seas, that memory was tactile and immediate. The creatures that lived there were shaped by its moods. The pressure of depth moulded their bodies. The flow of currents directed their evolution. The first, exoskeletons, were not just defenses, they were responses to the weight of water, the constant dialogue between resistance and surrender. Life learned its form through the language of liquid, and in doing so, it learned to move with grace. There is a reason, perhaps, that even now water feels ancient to us. To touch it is to touch something that has existed in almost the same form since before memory itself. The molecules in a single drop may have passed through the gills of Cambrian creatures, through clouds that fell on primordial continents, through the breath of every being that followed. The water in our blood once moved through those same oceans, carrying the same rhythm and the same pulse. We are, in a very real sense, extensions of that memory, the ocean dreaming through us. If you imagine diving into those early seas, you might sense that continuity. The light would filter down in shifting beams, soft and golden, scattering across suspended particles. Every movement you made would echo outward, joining the quiet pulse of the whole. Around you, life would move in harmony, some slow, some darting, all responding to the same invisible cues. The ocean would feel alive, not as a backdrop, but as a being. It would seem to breathe, to listen, to remember. Every bubble that rose toward the surface would be a thought dissolving into light. Scientists often describe the Cambrian oceans in terms of biology and chemistry. Oxygen levels rising, calcium concentrations changing, ecosystems stabilizing. But beneath those measurable shifts lies something less tangible, the emotional texture of the world itself. The ocean was not merely reacting, it was evolving, a kind of rhythm that bordered on awareness. Its cycles of temperature, its patterns of flow, were the foundation for the first biological senses. The creatures of that age didn't just live in water, they lived through it, perceiving their world by the way the water moved. Sound, vibration, pressure, all became forms of knowledge carried by the liquid memory that surrounded them. Perhaps consciousness itself was shaped by that environment. To be aware, after all, is to feel the world move through you and to remember that movement. In the Cambrian Ocean, life learned to do exactly that. Awareness began as the ability to sense change in water, the passing of a shadow, the tremor of a current, the warmth of sunlight fading with depth. Each sensation was stored, repeated, reinforced. The ocean was both teacher and archive, showing life how to perceive, how to remember, how to adapt. The memory of water became the memory of mind. Even now, when we listen to the sound of waves or watch the reflection of light across a lake, something ancient stirs within us. It is the memory not of a place, but of a state of being. We recognize, in the ocean's restlessness, the same pulse that once flowed through our earliest ancestors. It calls to us not with words, but with resonance. The rhythm of water is the rhythm of thought, the quiet continuity between the living and the eternal. The Cambrian seas no longer exist in their original form, but their essence endures. The same water that filled them still circulates through Earth's veins, through rivers, clouds, and blood. Every drop that falls as rain, every tear that forms, carries the same molecules that once touched the shells of trilobites. It is a continuity so vast that it defies imagination, and yet it is intimate, immediate, within us. When we drink, we take in the memory of worlds that came before. When we breathe, we release it again. The ocean still dreams through us, still remembers through us, still asks us to listen. And perhaps that is what the Cambrian period truly taught the Earth, that memory need not be fixed in stone to endure. It can flow, it can change, it can take on new forms without losing its essence. The water that once held the first stirrings of consciousness now holds us, carrying the same ancient knowledge in its endless cycles. The memory of water is the memory of life itself, unbroken, ever moving, patient as time. When you stand at the edge of the sea and watch the waves fold and return, you are witnessing that same story still being told. The rhythm that shaped the Cambrian world continues, whispering softly in every tide. It speaks of beginnings that never ended, of life that remembers itself not in words but in motion. The ocean, in all its depth and silence, still carries the first memory of awareness. And if you listen long enough, if you let the sound of the water sink into you, you might hear it too, the voice of an ancient world, murmuring through the flow of existence. I remember. 20. The echo of creation. There is a hum that runs through everything, a vibration that has never stopped since the first atoms came together and began to dance. It began long before the Cambrian, long before the earth cooled or the oceans formed, but in that extraordinary age of light and movement, the hum found voice. The Cambrian Explosion was not only the birth of diversity, it was the echo of creation itself, the universe remembering how to sing. Every creature, every shell, Every flicker of motion was part of that ancient chorus, a resonance of matter becoming aware of its own rhythm. Even now, 500 million years later, the sound of that awakening lingers. It vibrates quietly in our cells, in the heartbeat of every living thing, in the subtle music of existence that never truly fades. When we imagine the Cambrian world, we often see it through still images, fossils pressed into stone, frozen moments of a life that once moved. But in truth, that age was anything but silent or still. The seas shimmered with colour and motion, with countless forms exploring what it meant to exist. Light filtered through the water in ribbons, painting the ocean floor with living shadows. Each species was an experiment, a verse in a song too vast to fully hear. Together, they composed the first great symphony of life, a harmony of chaos and order, of chance and purpose, of form learning to follow flow. The echo of creation was not only in what lived, but in what was lost. For every creature that survived, countless others vanished. Extinction was not failure, it was rhythm. The silence that followed each disappearance allowed new melodies to form. Life has always composed itself this way, through improvisation, through variation, through endings that make room for beginnings. The Cambrian taught the earth how to keep time with itself, how to let go and begin again. It was a kind of music that played not through sound, but through transformation. If you could listen closely enough, perhaps you would hear it still. The slow vibration of water against shell, the ripple of fin through current, the low hum of motion beneath the surface of things. It is not music in the human sense, it has no measure, no melody, but it carries a rhythm that feels familiar. Our bodies respond to it instinctively, as if they remember. The pulse of blood, the rhythm of breath, the steady beat of a heart, all are echoes of that same ancient cadence. The universe has been keeping time since long before we learned to count it. The Cambrian Explosion was a convergence of everything the planet had prepared for. Oxygen had gathered in the seas, minerals had enriched the sediments, genes had evolved the tools for complexity. It was as though the universe had been waiting for the right chord to resolve. When it did, life erupted in harmony. The creatures that emerged were not random. They were the culmination of a melody that had been building since the first molecules of RNA formed in the deep. The Cambrian was the crescendo, the moment the world became self-aware through abundance. To witness that time would have been to see creation as a process, not an event. There was no beginning and no end, only the flow of one pattern into another. Some creatures built shells, others built spines, others built eyes, but all were expressions of the same underlying song. The earth was experimenting with form, shaping energy into life and letting it unfold. Each new species was a note, and together they formed chords of interaction, predator and prey, movement and rest, light and shadow. The Cambrian was not a sudden explosion, but a harmony deepening across the scales of time. And perhaps that is what creation has always been, not a singular act, but a resonance that continues. Every sunrise, every wave, every heartbeat is a continuation of that original sound. The universe never stopped creating, it simply changed tempo. The same energy that stirred the oceans now flows through galaxies, through neurons, through thought. The echo of creation moves through everything that exists, an unbroken thread connecting the first breath of life to the last sigh of the stars. Even now, when we look out into space or down into the depths of the sea, we are listening for that echo. We search for signs of life elsewhere, not out of loneliness, but because we recognize the sound of creation when we hear it. It's the same hum that fills the spaces between atoms, the same rhythm that guides the growth of coral and the orbit of planets. We are not separate from that sound. We are part of it. The voice of the universe speaks through us, through our awareness, through the questions we ask about where we came from and what it means to exist. Perhaps that is why silence feels sacred. In the absence of noise, we can sometimes hear the subtler music beneath. The wind through trees, the breath between waves, the slow movement of clouds all carry the same cadence that began long ago. The Cambrian seas may be gone, but their rhythm continues, echoed in every form of life that descended from them. The jellyfish drifting through the ocean today moves with the same pulse as its ancient ancestors. The shimmer of fish beneath the surface repeats patterns, first written 500 million years ago. Even the way we dream fluid, non-linear, filled with motion and transformation, reflects the memory of that ancient rhythm. The echo of creation is not always peaceful. It contains dissonance, tension, decay, but it is precisely in those imperfections that harmony finds depth. The Cambrian world was full of both beauty and brutality, of fragile balance and constant upheaval. Yet through that turbulence something extraordinary endured. Continuity. The song went on, reshaping itself with each generation, carrying forward the memory of what came before. Life learned to harmonize with change, to find melody even in chaos. That is the essence of creation, not control, but connection. If we could listen with more than our ears, we might hear how deeply we still belong to that music. Every heartbeat we feel is a resonance of the planet's own pulse. Every breath we take echoes the first breath of oxygen released into those ancient seas. Even our words, as they flow and pause, carry the rhythm of water, the rise and fall of the ocean's endless motion. We are not observers of creation. We are its echo chambers, resonating with the memory of what the universe has always been doing, becoming aware of itself. When the last light of day fades over the sea and the horizon melts into shadow, the water keeps moving, whispering softly to the shore. It is the same whisper that has moved through every age, the sound of creation remembering itself. The Cambrian Explosion was one moment in that vast continuum, but its echo never stopped. It travelled through time, through evolution, through the birth of consciousness, through the rise of thought and memory and wonder. It reached us, and through us, it continues. Perhaps that is the truest meaning of life, not to begin or to end, but to carry the echo forward. To live is to vibrate with the memory of creation, to add one's own note to the infinite song. We are each a fragment of that resonance, still unfolding, still learning how to listen. The Cambrian world may have faded into stone, but its music plays on in every wave, every pulse, every breath of existence. And if you listen closely, in the quiet between your thoughts, you might still hear it, the first echo of creation, faint but eternal, humming softly through the rhythm of being.